My name is Chloe, 32 years old, and I stood shivering in the cold Atlanta night watching my entire life burn to the ground. When I called my mother for a single shred of comfort, she sighed over the clinking glasses of her country club and told me I should have been more careful with my little catering hobby. She hung up on me while I choked on the smell of smoke and ash. I had no idea that the fire consuming my apartment was not an accident, and that a single notification on my phone was about to unravel a web of family betrayal so deep it would end with my brother-in-law in handcuffs and my parents begging for mercy. Before I tell you how I used their own greed to destroy their perfect upper-class world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been treated like the black sheep of your family. The flashing red and blue lights of the fire trucks painted the street in a chaotic rhythm. I wrapped my thin coat tighter around my shoulders, shivering violently despite the intense heat radiating from the blazing building in front of me. My ground-floor apartment was entirely engulfed in towering orange flames. Thick black smoke billowed into the dark Atlanta sky, carrying with it the ashes of everything I had worked so hard to build. This was not just where I slept. It was my private luxury test kitchen. I stood there paralyzed by shock, watching the heavy glass of my custom-imported oven shatter from the extreme temperature. Years of meticulous culinary research, thousands of dollars in specialized equipment, and stacks of my handwritten recipe journals were turning into meaningless gray dust right before my eyes. To the outside world, and especially to my family, I was just a struggling cook trying to make ends meet. But the truth was far different. I worked as a highly sought-after private chef serving the absolute elite. My clients were billionaires, tech moguls, and celebrities who valued my intense discretion as much as my culinary talent. My kitchen was my sanctuary, a place where I was in complete control, far away from the stifling expectations of the Dubois family. Now that sanctuary was nothing but a roaring inferno. A firefighter rushed past me, shouting orders to his crew as a powerful stream of water hit the collapsing roof. The sound of hissing steam and cracking wood was deafening. My hands trembled as I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked from when I had dropped it fleeing the building, but it still worked. In that moment of sheer devastation, all I wanted was my mother. I needed to hear a comforting voice, to be told that everything would be okay, to feel like I had a safe place to go. I dialed Valerie Dubois. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. I expected to hear concern in her voice, but instead I was met with the loud, upbeat tempo of a live jazz band and the obnoxious chatter of wealthy socialites. My parents belonged to the upper crust of Atlanta society, obsessed with their country club status and maintaining a flawless image. "Hello," Valerie answered, her voice laced with immediate irritation. "Chloe, I am in the middle of a very important dinner." "What is it, Mom?" I choked out, coughing as a gust of wind blew foul-smelling smoke in my direction. "My apartment is on fire. Everything is gone. The whole place is burning down." There was a brief pause on the line. I waited for the gasp of horror, the frantic questions about my safety, the immediate offer to send a car to pick me up. Instead, she let out a long, dramatic sigh. "Well, that is not our problem, Chloe," she said dismissively. "I told you 100 times you should have been more careful with your little catering hobby. Having commercial equipment in a residential unit is just irresponsible." I stared at the burning building, my chest tightening with a pain that had nothing to do with the smoke inhalation. "Mom, I have no clothes. I have nowhere to go. I just watched my home burn." Valerie clicked her tongue in annoyance. "We are extremely busy prepping for Vanessa and her big book launch tomorrow. You know how important this $2 million publishing deal is for her and for the family image. Tristan invited several major investors to the gala, and we cannot afford any distractions right now. Handle it yourself, Chloe. Grow up and figure it out. Please do not call back tonight. We are entertaining." The line went completely dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. The jazz music was gone, replaced once again by the roar of the fire and the shouting of the emergency crews. My own mother had not even asked if I was injured. She had not asked if I had inhaled smoke or if I needed a place to sleep. Her only concern was my younger sister Vanessa, the undisputed golden child of the family, and Tristan, the arrogant real estate manager she had married. They were the stars of the Dubois family, the perfect couple who validated my parents' obsession with wealth and status. I was just the embarrassing daughter who worked in a kitchen. A firefighter approached me, wiping soot from his brow. He looked at me with deep sympathy and asked if I had family nearby to stay with. I swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I shook my head and told him no, I had no one. I stood alone on the sidewalk, the heat of my ruined life warming my face, realizing that the people who shared my blood would gladly watch me burn if it meant protecting their pristine social calendar. As I turned away from the blazing ruins to find a quiet place to sit, my cracked phone vibrated in the palm of my hand. I looked down at the illuminated screen. A new text message notification had just popped up, cutting through the darkness. It was a message that would change the trajectory of my entire life, pulling me into a nightmare of greed and betrayal that I could never have anticipated. My mother had just hung up when the sharp ping of a text message demanded my attention. The glowing screen illuminated the ash falling around me. I wiped dark soot from my mobile phone. It was from Vanessa, my golden child sister, the woman who had spent 29 years being handed the world on a silver platter. I opened the message foolishly, hoping my mother had told her what happened. I hoped Vanessa was texting to see if I was safe. Instead, the words were a masterclass in callousness. Tristan told me about your stove catching fire. Please do not bring your smoky, depressing energy to my launch party tomorrow. You always ruin everything. I stared at the words. Tristan told me everything. How did my brother-in-law know about my apartment fire before it was on the news? I had not called him. A cold knot formed in my stomach, competing with the blistering heat radiating from my destroyed kitchen. Vanessa did not ask if I made it out alive. She only cared about her precious cookbook launch party happening tomorrow. A cookbook filled with stolen recipes she could not even pronounce. A heavy black boot crunched loudly on broken glass nearby. I looked up to see a firefighter walking toward me. He pulled off his helmet, examining the charred remains of my ground-floor apartment, and turned his gaze toward me. "We got the main blaze under control," he said gently. "But the structure is a total loss. The roof over your kitchen completely caved in. Do you have a place to stay tonight? Any family you can call to pick you up?" I looked at my ruined shoes. A bitter laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it. "I have family," I replied softly, my throat still raspy from the thick smoke. "But they do not open their doors for people like me." The firefighter frowned. "You just lost your home. Surely they can spare a couch." "You do not understand the Dubois family," I said. "If I were a corporate lawyer or a white real estate mogul like Tristan, they would send a town car right now. But I am just a private chef. To my parents, I am the family embarrassment. The girl who plays in the kitchen. They are hosting a gala tomorrow for my sister. A fire is too messy for their pristine social calendar." I did not tell the firefighter the rest of the truth. I did not tell him that my so-called catering hobby was actually a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I did not tell him that I catered for billionaires who paid thousands of dollars for a single dinner service. To Desmond and Valerie, success was only valid if it looked a certain way. They worshipped country club memberships and the old money aesthetic Tristan brought to the family. They saw my hands calloused from chopping as a mark of lower-class labor. I was a stain on their perfect upper-class African-American dynasty, so I let them believe I was struggling. I turned back to the smoldering ruins of my apartment. The front window of my test kitchen was completely blown out. I could see the blackened, twisted metal of my imported stove. The custom prep tables were reduced to charcoal. But the most devastating loss was hidden in the corner where my heavy oak bookshelf used to stand. That bookshelf held a decade of my culinary research, stacks of handwritten leather journals containing hundreds of proprietary recipes, spice blend ratios, and cultural anecdotes passed down from my grandmother. All of it reduced to gray powder. "Ma'am, you need to step back behind the yellow tape," another voice called out. I blinked, pulling myself out of my grief. A man was walking toward me, but he was not dressed in turnout gear. He wore a dark windbreaker with the letters Arson Investigation printed in bold yellow across the back. He was tall, with sharp assessing eyes that seemed to take in every detail of my soot-stained face. "I am Investigator Hayes," he said, stopping a few feet away from me. His tone was professional, but there was an underlying tension in his voice that immediately put me on alert. "Is it completely gone?" I asked, gesturing to the apartment. "Did the gas line rupture?" Hayes did not pull out a standard accident report clipboard. He did not ask me if I had left a burner on. Instead, he reached into the deep pocket of his windbreaker and pulled out a small, transparent plastic evidence bag. "We need to ask you some questions about the origins of this fire," Miss Dubois, Hayes said, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Specifically, we need to know exactly who had access to your apartment this evening." I frowned, my confusion mounting. "No one. I live alone. I work alone. Why are you asking me that?" Investigator Hayes held the plastic evidence bag up to the flashing emergency lights. The object inside glinted brightly, a stark contrast to the darkness and destruction around us. It was not a piece of charred wood or a melted gas valve. "Because we found this near the suspected point of ignition," Hayes said evenly, "and it did not melt." I stared at the object in the bag and all the blood drained from my face. My heart slammed against my ribs. Inside the plastic was a heavy, solid gold cufflink shaped into a highly stylized letter T. It was a custom one-of-a-kind design. I knew exactly what it was because I was standing right next to my father when he commissioned it. I remembered the arrogant and deeply entitled smirk on Tristan's white face when he first put it on. I remembered how my father patted his shoulder, welcoming him to the family. It was the exact cufflink Desmond had given to Tristan on his wedding day. The text message from Vanessa was a masterclass in cruelty, but before I could even process my sister's venom, a shadow fell over my phone screen. I looked up. Investigator Hayes stood before me, blocking out the glare of the fire trucks. He was a tall, imposing man with sharp eyes that seemed to cut right through the chaos of the night. His heavy windbreaker smelled of chemicals and wet ash. He did not have a standard accident report clipboard in his hands. He did not carry the demeanor of a man dealing with a simple kitchen mishap. "Miss Dubois, I need you to step away from the crowd and come with me," he said. His voice was low, carrying an undeniable weight. I followed him to the back of his unmarked command vehicle, my boots crunching on the wet, debris-covered pavement. The night air was freezing, but a different kind of cold began to seep into my bones. Hayes opened the back hatch of his SUV and turned to face me. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not tell me that everything was going to be all right. "I have been doing this a long time," Hayes began, folding his arms across his chest. "A grease fire burns a certain way. A ruptured gas line leaves a very specific signature. The fire in your kitchen did neither." I stared at him, my smoke-irritated throat suddenly feeling incredibly dry. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I am saying your stove did not catch fire by accident," he replied flatly. "We found a distinct V pattern originating from the baseboards near the back alley window. The burn was too fast, too aggressive for a standard residential kitchen fire. My dogs picked up the scent immediately. Someone doused the exterior window frame and the interior floorboards with a heavy-grade chemical accelerant. Miss Dubois, your apartment was deliberately set on fire. This is arson." The word hung in the damp air between us. Arson. Someone had intentionally walked up to my sanctuary, poured a flammable liquid, and struck a match. My mind raced through a list of angry former employees, difficult clients, or random vandals. But nothing made sense. I kept my business completely discreet. I did not have enemies in the culinary world. "Who would do that?" I asked, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Arsonists are rarely professionals," Hayes said, reaching into the deep pocket of his windbreaker. "They get an adrenaline rush. They panic. The heat pushes them back faster than they anticipate, and when they run, they get sloppy. They leave things behind." He pulled his hand out of his pocket and held it up to the harsh glare of a nearby street lamp. He was holding a transparent plastic evidence bag. The bag was smudged with dark soot on the outside, but the object sealed inside caught the light gleaming with a heavy, unmistakable brilliance. "We found this caught in the window screen mesh at the point of ignition," Hayes said, holding the bag out to me. Do you recognize it? I leaned in, my eyes narrowing as I tried to focus through the lingering smoke. My breath hitched violently in my chest. All the ambient noise of the sirens, the shouting firefighters, and the rushing water seemed to vanish, leaving only a deafening ringing in my ears. Inside the plastic bag was a solid gold cufflink. It was incredibly heavy and shaped into a highly stylized modern letter T. The edges were encrusted with a subtle row of tiny black diamonds. It was not a mass-produced piece of jewelry. It was a custom one, of a kind commission. I knew exactly what it was because I was standing right next to my father 2 years ago when he ordered it. My mind violently flashed back to Vanessa's lavish country club wedding. I remembered standing in the bridal suite feeling invisible as usual while my father Desmond proudly presented a velvet box to his new son-in-law. I remembered the arrogant, entitled smirk on Tristan's white face as he pulled the gold T out of the box and fastened it to his expensive tuxedo shirt. I remembered my father clapping Tristan on the shoulder, proudly declaring that only the absolute best was acceptable for the man taking care of the Dubois family legacy. Desmond had idolized Tristan. He worshipped the old money aesthetic and the corporate real estate pedigree Tristan brought to the family. To my parents, Tristan was the golden son they never had. It is Tristan's, I breathed, pointing a trembling finger at the bag. My brother-in-law. That is his cufflink. My father had it custom-made for their wedding. Hayes did not look surprised. He simply nodded and walked over to the passenger side of his vehicle. He reached inside and pulled out a rugged military-grade tablet. He swiped across the screen a few times before turning it to face me. We pulled the footage from the traffic camera at the intersection 50 yards down your alleyway, Hayes explained, tapping a grainy paused image on the screen. The timestamp on the video is exactly 4 minutes before your neighbor called 911. I stared at the screen. The image was dark and slightly blurry, but the vehicle speeding away from the alley was unmistakable. It was a pristine white Range Rover autobiography. It had the exact blacked-out rims and tinted windows that Tristan boasted about buying last month. There was no denying it. The cufflink, the car, the timing. The golden boy of the Dubois family had driven to my apartment in the middle of the night and burned my life to the ground. But why? The question echoed in my mind loud and agonizing. Tristan was a wealthy real estate director. He drove a $100,000 car and lived in a Buckhead mansion with my sister. Why would he sneak into the shadows like a common criminal to destroy a private kitchen? It made absolutely no sense. There had to be a reason, a massive hidden motive that I could not yet see. Hayes locked the tablet and placed the evidence bag back into his pocket. His posture shifted, becoming completely businesslike. Miss Dubois, I have physical evidence at the scene and video placing his vehicle leaving the area. I have a judge on speed dial. I can have a warrant drafted and 2 squad cars at your brother-in-law's front door in 20 minutes. Do you want to press charges right now? I looked at the flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement. If Hayes arrested Tristan tonight, the Dubois family machine would instantly kick into gear. My father would hire the most ruthless defense attorneys in Georgia. They would claim the cufflink was stolen. They would claim Tristan lent his car to a friend. My parents would launch a public smear campaign against me, labeling me a jealous, hysterical sister trying to ruin a successful man. They would bury the evidence in legal red tape, and Tristan would walk away with a slap on the wrist, while I was left with nothing but ashes. I could not just attack. I needed to understand the mechanics of the trap before I sprang it. I needed to know exactly what Tristan was hiding and what my family was truly capable of. The trembling in my hands stopped entirely. The grief and shock that had paralyzed me just moments ago vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I looked Investigator Hayes directly in the eyes. My posture straightened and my voice was completely steady. No, I said softly. Hayes frowned, clearly confused. You have him dead to rights, Miss Dubois. Why wait? Because right now he thinks he got away with it, I replied, staring back at the smoldering remains of my home. If you arrest him tonight, he will hide behind my father's money. I need to know why he did this. Give me a few days, Investigator Hayes. Keep this quiet. Let him get comfortable. When I finally strike, I am going to bring you the entire puzzle, and I am going to make sure he has absolutely nowhere left to hide. The morning sun did nothing to warm the chill that had settled into my bones. I had not slept a single minute. I drove straight from the ashes of my apartment to the sprawling Buckhead estate my parents called home. The imposing wrought iron gates swung open automatically, recognizing my car's transponder. I drove up the winding, meticulously manicured driveway, the smell of burned plastic and charred wood clinging to my hair and clothes. It was a stark, sickening contrast to the pristine white columns of the Dubois mansion. I did not bother ringing the bell. I pushed past the heavy mahogany front doors and followed the sound of light laughter and clinking crystal echoing from the sunroom. They were having brunch, an elegant, relaxed Sunday brunch. My father Desmond sat at the head of the table in a crisp polo shirt, reading the financial section of the newspaper. My mother Valerie was adjusting a massive floral arrangement, discussing the final details for the book launch with my sister. Vanessa sat there glowing her perfect blowout, catching the morning light. And right beside her sat Tristan. He was slicing into a perfectly poached egg, looking completely at ease. I stepped into the sunroom, the harsh smell of smoke immediately cutting through the scent of fresh lilies and expensive coffee. Conversation stopped. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me. No one gasped in horror at my soot-stained face. No one rushed forward to see if I was hurt. Valerie pinched the bridge of her nose. "Chloe, I specifically asked you not to bring that depressing energy here today. You smell like a campfire. We have guests arriving in a few hours." I ignored her. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Tristan. I walked around the long glass table, my heavy boots leaving faint ash footprints on the pristine white rug. Tristan looked up at me, raising a single blonde eyebrow in an expression of mild, polite concern. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the high-resolution photographs Investigator Hayes had printed for me, and slammed them directly onto Tristan's plate. The heavy, glossy paper landed right on top of his food. The first photo was a crystal-clear close-up of the solid gold T cufflink sitting in the evidence bag. The second was the security still of his white Range Rover speeding out of my alleyway. "Care to explain how your custom wedding gift ended up at the exact point of ignition in my kitchen?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Deadly." Tristan blinked. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine panic flash in his pale blue eyes. But it vanished just as quickly as it appeared. He leaned back in his chair, picking up his linen napkin and casually wiping a drop of hollandaise sauce from his chin. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with condescending calm. "Is that my cufflink? I thought I lost it at the gym last week." "You burned my home to the ground," I stated, stepping closer. "You drove to my apartment, poured chemical accelerant over the floorboards, and set it on fire." Desmond slammed his hand down on the glass table. The silverware rattled. "Are you insane, Chloe?" he roared, standing up so fast his chair tipped backward. "How dare you march into this house and accuse Tristan of such a psychotic thing? Tristan was here all night." "He was not here," I shot back, pointing at the photograph. "That is his car leaving my street 4 minutes before the fire department was called." "It is a white SUV," Chloe Valerie snapped, standing up to join my father. "Half of Atlanta drives a white SUV. As for the cufflink, some thug probably stole it out of his locker and dropped it while trying to rob your dump of an apartment." I stared at my mother, entirely stunned by the sheer velocity of her denial. They were looking right at the evidence. It was sitting on the table. But rather than face the truth that their perfect white son-in-law was an arsonist, they instantly fabricated an imaginary thug to take the blame. "He is lying to you," I said, looking between my parents. "Ask him to show you his keys. Ask him to show you where he was at 2 a.m. Vanessa suddenly burst into loud theatrical tears. She buried her face in Tristan's shoulder. "I cannot believe you are doing this to me, Chloe," she sobbed, her voice trembling with fake devastation. "Today is the biggest day of my life. My cookbook is launching and you are so jealous of my success that you are trying to frame my husband for a crime. You just want to ruin my day because your own little catering hobby went up in smoke." Tristan wrapped a protective arm around Vanessa, kissing the top of her head. "It is okay, darling," he whispered soothingly. "We know she is just lashing out because she is hurting." He looked at me, and a slow, smug, completely untouchable smirk spread across his face. He reached for his mimosa, taking a leisurely sip. "You are trying to extort us," Valerie declared, crossing her arms over her silk blouse. "That is what this is about. Your failing kitchen burned down because of your own negligence, and now you want Tristan's money to bail you out. Well, we are not writing you a check, Chloe. You are not going to shake down a successful real estate director just because you are jealous." "I am not asking for a check," I said, my voice hardening. "I am telling you that the man sitting at your table is a criminal. The fire investigator already has this evidence." "Then let the police handle it." Desmond barked, his face red with fury. "But until then, you will not disrespect my son-in-law under my roof. Tristan is family. He provides for this family. You are a bitter, struggling cook who cannot take responsibility for her own mistakes. Get out of my house." I stood there, the weight of their collective betrayal pressing down on my chest. They had made their choice. They were choosing the illusion of the wealthy, connected son-in-law over the life of their own daughter. "Get out!" Desmond yelled again, pointing toward the hallway. "And do not come back until you are ready to apologize to Tristan and your sister." I did not say another word. I turned around to leave. As I walked away from the table, Tristan stood up. "Let me walk you to the door, Chloe," he said. He sounded like the perfect magnanimous gentleman playing his role for my parents. He followed me into the grand foyer, away from the immediate earshot of the sunroom. As I reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door, Tristan stepped directly behind me. He leaned in so close I could smell the expensive champagne on his breath. I turned my head slightly, my eyes narrowing. Tristan smiled, a cold, predatory expression that completely dropped his friendly facade. He leaned his lips right next to my ear. "Should have read the fine print on your lease, chef," he whispered. I walked out of the heavy double doors of the Dubois mansion, the brass handles cold against my skin. I did not look back. I drove until the sprawling, manicured lawns of Buckhead gave way to the cracked pavement and flickering neon of a highway motel. Room 14 smelled of stale bleach and old cigarettes. It was a miserable room. It was an isolating room. It was the only room I could afford. I sat cross-legged on the lumpy mattress, pulling my backup laptop from my duffel bag. It was a cheap, heavy machine I used strictly for inventory, but right now it was the most powerful weapon I possessed. Tristan's whisper echoed in the cramped space, bouncing off the thin walls. "Should have read the fine print on your lease, chef." What fine print? What lease? What did a commercial rental contract have to do with my family's golden boy? I intended to find out. I intended to tear his life apart. Desmond Dubois was a man who commanded corporate boardrooms but could barely operate a smartphone. Years ago, before my culinary business took off, I was the one who set up the internal email servers for the Dubois Family Trust. I did the coding. I set the administrative backdoors. Desmond never bothered to hire a professional IT firm to update the security protocols, and he certainly never bothered to change the master password I had created for him. I opened a secure browser, my fingers flying across the keys. A few lines of code, a bypass of the outdated firewall, and I was in. The entire digital footprint of my family's wealth, managed almost exclusively by Tristan for the past 3 years, was laid bare before me. I started with Tristan's private correspondence folder. If he was hiding behind my father's money, the evidence would be in the ledgers. I expected to find offshore accounts. I expected to find hidden mistress funds. I expected standard corporate greed. What I found was sheer, unadulterated panic. I opened a chain of emails between Tristan and a private offshore brokerage firm, dated over the last 6 months. The subject lines grew increasingly desperate. Margin call, urgent, liquidation warning, final notice. I read through the attached financial statements, and the illusion of Tristan, the brilliant real estate mogul, shattered completely. He had not been investing the family's money in commercial properties. He had been illegally diverting millions of dollars from the Dubois Trust into highly volatile, unregulated cryptocurrency markets. And he had lost. He had lost everything. The golden son-in-law was entirely bankrupt, drowning in 8 figures of hidden debt, and the brokers were threatening to seize his remaining assets by the end of the month. He was desperate. He was terrified. He was trapped. But desperate men do not randomly burn down their sister-in-law's kitchen unless there is a direct financial benefit. I typed my own name into the search bar, cross-referencing it with the property management files for my commercial kitchen space. I paid my rent every month to a generic LLC based out of Delaware. I never questioned it. I pulled up the corporate registration documents for the LLC, peeling back the layers of shell companies Tristan had buried it under. My breath caught in my throat. The Delaware LLC was a subsidiary of the Dubois Family Trust. I had been paying rent to my own family for 3 years. The trust owned the building. Tristan managed the building. I clicked on the latest PDF attached to the property file. It was an insurance binder approved and underwritten exactly 21 days ago. Tristan had quietly restructured the insurance on my building, taking out a massive comprehensive commercial fire policy. The payout for a total structural loss of my specific ground floor unit was precisely $3 million. Then I found the fine print. Tristan had recently updated the lease agreement terms for all tenants. A tiny clause buried on page 12 waived the landlord's liability for tenant property in the event of an act of God or fire. If the building burned, the tenants got nothing. The landlord got everything. The math was sickeningly simple. Tristan needed cash immediately to cover his crypto losses before my father discovered the missing trust funds. He owned the building. He insured the building. He burned the building. He drove over in the middle of the night, poured accelerant on my life's work, and lit the match. I was not just a victim of a random crime. I was the scapegoat for a calculated multi-million-dollar insurance fraud. He knew my parents would blame my recklessness. He knew they would refuse to look deeper. He had weaponized my status as the family disappointment to pull off the perfect crime. I sat back, the green neon light from the motel sign washing over my face. I had the motive. I had the digital paper trail. I had the exact evidence to hand over to Investigator Hayes. I could send Tristan to federal prison for arson and fraud by morning. But my finger hovered over the mouse pad. Tristan's arrogance at brunch nagged at me. Vanessa's theatrical tears felt too perfectly timed. My sister had spent her entire life protecting her own interests. It was hard to believe she was completely ignorant of her husband's impending financial ruin. She was too smart. She was too calculating. She was too selfish. I navigated away from Tristan's folder and accessed the server handling Vanessa's lifestyle brand. Her inbox was a clutter of event planners, publicists, and caterers. I ran a search for the word kitchen. Dozens of emails populated. I clicked on a thread between Vanessa and her literary agent dated 2 months ago, right around the time Tristan's crypto accounts began tanking. The agent was threatening to cancel Vanessa's lucrative cookbook deal. Vanessa had failed to produce a single original recipe. The manuscript was entirely empty. The publishers were demanding their advance back, threatening a massive breach of contract lawsuit that would publicly humiliate the Dubois family. Then I opened Vanessa's reply sent the very next morning. Do not cancel the deal. I have secured an entire archive of unpublished proprietary Southern fusion recipes. Generations of undocumented culinary research. It will be in your hands before the launch party. Just give me time to acquire the physical journals. The blood froze in my veins. The air in the motel room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. My journals. The leather-bound notebooks holding a decade of my culinary research, my grandmother's secrets, my exact spice blends. The journals were the only things completely destroyed in the fire. Or so I thought. Tristan did not just set the fire for the insurance money. He set the fire to cover up a theft. Vanessa needed my recipes to save her failing empire. Tristan needed the insurance payout to save his life. They took my home. They took my work. They took my legacy. They had worked together. I stared at the glowing screen of my battered backup laptop, my eyes burning from exhaustion and lingering smoke as the true magnitude of the betrayal washed over me. I clicked on the massive PDF attachment in Vanessa's sent folder. The file was titled simply Dubois Southern Elegance Final Draft. My hand hovered over the trackpad. I double-tapped the file. A high-resolution mock-up of the book cover filled my screen. There was Vanessa wearing a pristine white designer apron that had never seen a single drop of grease, smiling radiantly over a rustic spread of Southern cuisine. The subtitle read, Authentic Generational Recipes, From My Heart to Your Home. I scrolled down to the table of contents, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Page 12 featured Grandmare's Midnight Gumbo. Page 45 listed the Dubois Creole Rub. Page 80 showcased my cast-iron peach cobbler with bourbon glaze. I clicked to page 12. It was not a variation. It was not a loose adaptation. It was a word-for-word transcription of the recipe my grandmother had taught me when I was 9 years old. I read the instructions, recognizing my own specific phrasing, my own distinct shorthand notations that I had meticulously recorded in my leather-bound journals. Vanessa had even copied my exact warning about letting the roux achieve a dark penny copper brown before adding the holy trinity of vegetables. I kept scrolling, my stomach twisting into a sickening knot. It was not just the recipes, she had stolen the stories. Vanessa wrote movingly about standing on a wooden step stool in the sweltering heat of a Louisiana summer kitchen, learning the delicate art of balancing thyme and cayenne. She wrote about the calluses on her fingers from chopping endless rows of onions and celery. She wrote about the deep spiritual connection she felt to our ancestors every time she fired up a cast-iron skillet. It was a complete fabrication. Vanessa had never cooked a single meal in her life. She detested the smell of frying oil in her hair. She outsourced all her dinner parties to expensive catering companies. Every anecdote, every childhood memory, every ounce of passion poured onto those pages belonged exclusively to me. She had taken my memories, stripped away my name, and plastered her own flawless, marketable face over my life's work. I opened another email thread, this one between Vanessa and the senior acquisitions editor at a major New York publishing house. The contract details were explicitly laid out. Vanessa was receiving a $2 million advance for the book, with massive royalties tied to a nationwide morning television tour. But the publisher had been growing suspicious. The editor had sent a sharp email a month ago demanding to see the original handwritten family journals Vanessa kept boasting about in her pitch meetings to verify the authenticity of the historical claims before they went to print. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Vanessa was trapped. She had sold a $2 million lie, and the publisher was demanding physical proof. She could not produce the journals because they sat on the heavy oak bookshelf in my test kitchen. If she asked for them, I would know about the book. If the book published without my knowledge, I would instantly recognize my work and sue her for intellectual property theft, ruining her meticulously curated lifestyle brand and dragging the prestigious Dubois family name through the mud. And then there was Tristan. Tristan drowning in millions of dollars of hidden cryptocurrency debt, facing immediate margin calls and the total liquidation of his assets. Tristan, who managed the Dubois family trust and had the power to quietly rewrite the commercial insurance policy on the exact building I rented. They were the perfect parasitic team. Tristan needed $3 million in untraceable insurance cash to save his financial life. Vanessa needed the physical evidence of her massive intellectual property theft reduced to ashes before her launch party. So they made a pact. Tristan would get his payout from the insurance company completely covered by the fine print he buried in my lease. Vanessa would get a clean slate telling her publisher that the precious family journals had been tragically lost in a devastating fire, forcing them to rely solely on her transcribed manuscript. They did not just burn down my apartment. They burned down my past, my present, and my future, all to line their own pockets and preserve their pristine social status. They had looked at me, their own flesh and blood, and saw nothing but a resource to be harvested and an obstacle to be eradicated. Desmond and Valerie's willful blindness was not just enabling, it was the exact shield Tristan and Vanessa used to operate with total impunity. I closed the laptop. The sudden darkness in the cheap motel room mirrored the cold, absolute void that had just opened up inside my chest. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at their table. I had endured the subtle insults, the blatant favoritism, and the endless feeling of being the Dubois family's dirty little secret. I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just stayed quiet and built my own success, they would eventually respect me. I was wrong. You cannot earn the respect of predators. You can only become their prey. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was cracked from the chaos of the fire, but it still worked. I had physical evidence of arson insurance fraud and millions of dollars in stolen intellectual property. But if I went to the police now, Desmond would deploy his army of corporate lawyers. He would bury me in injunctions, tie the evidence up in court for decades, and spin a media narrative painting me as a deranged, jealous extortionist trying to ruin her sister's big day. I did not need the police. I needed raw power. I needed someone who operated on a level that made the Dubois family look like amateurs. I opened my encrypted contacts list. I scrolled past the numbers for suppliers, local chefs, and ingredient purveyors. I stopped at a name saved under a secure alias, Marcus Vance. He was a ruthless, notoriously private venture capitalist. He bought and sold tech conglomerates for sport. He was a billionaire who trusted exactly 3 people in the world, and I was one of them, simply because I was the only private chef who never leaked a single word about the high-stakes clandestine meetings he hosted over the dinners I prepared. Marcus owed me a favor, a very large favor. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. It rang twice before a sharp, commanding voice answered. Chloe, Marcus said, sounding surprised. It is 3 in the morning. Is there a problem, Marcus? I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. I need to cash in that favor. I need your legal team. I need your forensic accountants, and I need them right now. I am going to dismantle a family trust by sunrise. Investigator Hayes was right. A fire leaves a signature, and so do people. Tristan's signature was sloppy, arrogant, and devastatingly easy to track if you knew where to look. I did not go back to the motel. I drove straight to Elias Vance's compound. Elias lived in a fortified penthouse overlooking the Atlanta skyline, a modern fortress of glass and steel. The massive gates parted silently the moment my license plate was scanned. Elias did not employ guards who asked questions. He employed professionals who knew exactly who was cleared for entry. I walked into his sprawling, minimalist foyer just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. Elias was already waiting in his study, sitting behind a slab of polished obsidian that served as his desk. He wore a crisp dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking completely unaffected by the early hour. He did not ask if I wanted tea. He did not offer meaningless sympathy. He simply pointed to the empty leather chair opposite him. Tell me what you have, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. I opened my laptop and slid it across the smooth stone surface. I laid out the entire timeline. I showed him the photographs of the solid gold cufflink. I showed him the security footage of Tristan's Range Rover fleeing the alleyway. Then I pulled up the internal emails I had ripped from the Dubois family trust server. I walked him through Tristan's catastrophic cryptocurrency losses, the millions of dollars hemorrhaging from my father's accounts, and the newly drafted $3 million commercial fire insurance policy on my exact kitchen unit. Finally, I showed him Vanessa's email thread with her New York publisher. Elias scrolled through the documents, his sharp eyes absorbing the data with terrifying speed. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the climate control system. They are sloppy, Elias finally said, leaning back in his chair. They built a house of cards on the assumption that you were too naive, too poor, and too desperate for their approval to ever look beneath the floorboards. They thought I was struggling, I replied, my voice hard. They thought I was a failure because I refused to play their corporate games. They do not know the truth about my business. Elias raised an eyebrow, a rare expression of genuine amusement crossing his face. And what is the truth, Chloe? You know the truth, Elias. I cater for you. I cater for your board members. I cater for international diplomats who demand absolute privacy. My private chef logistics company grosses 8 figures a year. I have more liquid capital right now than Tristan has ever seen in his lifetime. I kept it completely hidden because my parents are parasites. If Desmond and Valerie knew I was successful, they would have demanded a seat on my board. They would have paraded me around their country club to secure investors for Tristan's doomed real estate ventures. I stayed in the shadows to protect my peace. And they took advantage of that shadow to burn you alive, Elias noted, tapping a long finger against the obsidian desk. Your sister needed the physical journals destroyed, so you could never prove she stole your intellectual property. Your brother-in-law needed the insurance payout to cover his gambling debts before your father realized the trust was empty. Yes, I said, feeling the familiar sting of betrayal flare up in my chest. And it worked. The journals are gone. Decades of my grandmother's history, my spice ratios, my exact plating instructions. They are ashes. I can prove the arson, but proving the recipe theft without the original journals will be a massive, protracted legal nightmare. Elias stopped tapping his finger. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. Chloe, he said softly, you are a brilliant chef. You are a terrible IT manager. Do you remember 6 months ago when you catered that summit for the tech executives in my dining room? I nodded, confused by the sudden change in subject. I have a security protocol for anyone who operates within my inner circle, Elias explained. I told my lead engineer to run a quiet audit on your business networks to ensure you were not vulnerable to corporate espionage. What my team found was a complete lack of digital security. Your entire life's work was sitting on a single unencrypted hard drive in your kitchen. I stared at him, my heart beginning to hammer. Did you honestly think I would let the woman who prepares my food operate with such glaring vulnerabilities? Elias asked. I had my team mirror your entire system. We installed a military-grade encrypted cloud backup that updates your files in real time. Every recipe, every cultural anecdote, every single adjustment you made to those journals over the last 10 years is sitting safely on a secure server in Geneva. The air rushed out of my lungs. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by a sudden, intense wave of relief. My legacy was not gone. Vanessa had burned empty pages. She was sitting on a stolen empire, completely unaware that I held the digital master keys. We have the recipes, Elias said, his tone shifting back to pure calculating business. Now let us address your brother-in-law's immediate financial crisis. Elias turned the laptop back toward himself and began typing rapidly. Tristan is underwater. He is leveraging his corporate real estate debt to keep his crypto lenders at bay. His creditors are impatient. They do not want empty promises from a failing trust manager. They want cash, and they will sell his debt for pennies on the dollar just to clear their ledgers. What are you doing? I asked, watching the reflection of the screen dance across Elias's glasses. I am calling in my own favors, he replied. I am setting up a dummy corporation in the Cayman Islands, a completely untraceable shell company. I am going to buy 51% of Tristan's underwater real estate debt. I sat forward, gripping the arms of the leather chair. You are buying his debt. Elias hit the enter key with a definitive crack. It is already done. The wire transfers are clearing as we speak. I just bought the majority stake in his financial survival. And now, Chloe, I am transferring the controlling power of that shell company directly to you. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the kill. Tristan thinks he is waiting for a $3 million insurance check, Elias said. He thinks he is untouchable. He does not realize that as of 2 minutes ago, you own his debt. You own his assets. You own him. When the insurance company inevitably freezes his payout due to the ongoing arson investigation, you will be the one holding the hammer. I left Elias's fortified compound as the Atlanta sun began to burn through the morning haze. The air felt different in my lungs. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating smoke of my ruined kitchen, but the sharp electric current of absolute control. I had the digital keys to my grandmother's legacy, and I held the lethal majority stake in my brother-in-law's financial survival. But before I could move into the secure luxury safe house Elias had arranged for me, I needed to retrieve my few remaining personal items from the rundown motel. I pulled into the cracked asphalt lot of the motel, the tires of my car crunching over broken glass and discarded gravel. A sleek black town car was idling directly in front of room 14. The vehicle was a glaring anomaly against the backdrop of flickering neon and peeling paint. A man in a sharp-tailored gray suit stepped out of the driver's side as I approached. He did not look like a hitman. He looked like exactly what he was, a high-priced corporate courier. He intercepted me before I could reach the door, holding out a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the unmistakable embossed crest of my father's law firm. He did not speak. He simply held out a digital tablet waiting for my signature. I signed my name with a steady hand, took the heavy envelope, and walked into the stale, bleach-scented air of my room. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, the springs groaning in protest. I broke the wax seal. 2 items slid out onto the faded bedspread. The first was a cashier's check. I stared at the numbers printed across the top. $10,000. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed off the thin motel walls. $10,000. My high-end catering company grossed that amount before noon on a slow Tuesday. But to my parents, who believed I was nothing but a struggling small-time cook, this was supposed to be a fortune. It was a bribe disguised as charity. I picked up the second item. It was a dense multi-page legal document, a non-disclosure agreement. I recognized the ruthless, airtight formatting of my father's senior partners. The clauses were explicitly clear. By accepting the funds, I was legally bound to immediately drop any and all inquiries into the fire at my commercial property. I was required to surrender any remaining insurance claims directly to the property landlord, which was Tristan. Most sickeningly, I was mandated to cease all public and private contact with the Dubois family. The stated purpose of the document was buried on page 4. It read to preserve the reputational integrity and business interests of Tristan and Vanessa Dubois. My phone vibrated violently against the cheap wooden nightstand. A text message illuminated the cracked screen. It was from Valerie. My mother. Take the money and start over somewhere else. Don't embarrass us. I read the words again, then a third time. The utter callousness of the message stripped away the last lingering shred of hope I held for my family. They knew. Desmond and Valerie might not have lit the match themselves, but they knew exactly what Tristan had done. They knew he had destroyed my life to save his own skin, and they had collectively decided that my entire existence was worth a $10,000 payoff. They were paying me to disappear so Vanessa could launch her fraudulent $2 million cookbook without the annoying distraction of a police investigation. They wanted me to take the money and vanish. They expected me to fold just like the quiet, obedient disappointment I had always been. I picked up the cashier's check. The crisp, expensive paper felt heavy with their arrogance. I did not cry. I did not scream. The time for raw emotion had burned out in the ashes of my kitchen. I held the check between my thumbs and index fingers. Slowly, methodically, I tore it straight down the middle. I stacked the 2 halves and tore them again. I kept tearing, my hands moving with the precise rhythmic chop of a chef preparing a complicated dish until the $10,000 bribe was reduced to a pile of meaningless confetti. I scooped the shredded pieces of my parents' ultimate betrayal and dropped them into a plain white envelope I found in the motel desk drawer. I grabbed a cheap ballpoint pen and pulled out a single sheet of thin motel stationery. I did not write a manifesto. I did not demand an apology or threaten legal action. I wrote a single definitive sentence. See you at the launch party, E. I folded the note, shoved it in with the shredded check, and sealed the envelope. I addressed it directly to the Dubois family estate. I walked out to the lobby, dropped the envelope into the outgoing mail slot, and tossed my motel room key onto the front desk. I was done hiding in the margins of their lives. I drove straight to the address Elias had provided. It was a sprawling, ultra-luxury penthouse in the heart of Buckhead, guarded by silent men who nodded me through the private elevator banks. Elias had instructed his personal shopper to stock the residence for me, ensuring I had everything required for the coming war. I walked past the sweeping skyline views and stepped into the massive master dressing room. There, hanging perfectly in the center of the illuminated wardrobe, was a stunning tailored designer suit. It was cut from a rich, unforgiving crimson silk that looked exactly like fresh blood. I slipped the suit on. The crisp, structured lines hugged my frame, straightening my posture and forcing my shoulders back. I stepped in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror. I looked at the woman staring back at me. The exhausted, overlooked sister who desperately craved her family's validation was gone. She had died the moment Valerie sent that text. I smoothed the lapels of the crimson jacket, feeling the cool fabric settle against my skin like armor. The victim was dead. The executioner was ready. The valet at the Buckhead Country Club barely blinked at my arrival, though the crimson silk suit demanded attention. I bypassed the red carpet photo line, slipping through the heavy oak doors into the grand ballroom. The space was transformed into a grotesque monument to Vanessa. Floor-to-ceiling banners displayed her face. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with bite-sized versions of my grandmother's recipes. The air smelled of saffron toasted pecans and lies. Desmond and Valerie were holding court near the towering champagne pyramid. My mother wore a pale blue Chanel dress, laughing musically at something a state senator had just said. My father stood with his chest puffed out, holding a copy of Dubois' Southern Elegance like it was a sacred text. I watched as Valerie spotted me. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes darting to my outfit, then to my empty hands. She turned her back immediately, pulling Desmond by the elbow to face a group of food critics. They were actively ignoring my presence. They assumed the ripped-up check was a temper tantrum, a final gasp of rebellion before I quietly faded into the background. They introduced Vanessa to a New York Times reviewer as the true culinary genius of the Dubois family, completely erasing my existence. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. Before I could take a sip, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. Well, look who decided to show up. Tristan smelled of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence. He wore a custom tuxedo, his hair perfectly coiffed, flashing his blinding, practiced smile. He maneuvered me smoothly toward a cluster of local lifestyle journalists, ensuring we were in perfect view of the cameras. "I am surprised you had the nerve to come, Chloe," he said, his voice dropping an octave to feign sympathy, but loud enough for the reporters to catch. "After that tragic little fire at your apartment. We are all just so devastated for you. Completely wiped out, right? Such a shame." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had poured accelerant over my life's work. He had absolutely no idea that Elias Vance's offshore shell company had finalized the purchase of his underwater debt 3 hours ago. Tristan thought he was untouchable. He thought the insurance check was already in the mail. "You know," Tristan continued, leaning in close so I could smell the mint on his breath. "Vanessa and I were talking. We know things are tight for you right now. With the book taking off, my real estate firm is expanding our corporate offices. We are putting in a new cafeteria for the staff. It is not exactly high dining, mostly sandwiches and salads, but we need someone to manage the lunch shift. It pays a steady hourly wage. We would love to help you get back on your feet." He smiled magnanimously at the nearby reporters, waiting for them to document his incredible generosity to his unfortunate sister-in-law. I stared at him, my expression perfectly flat. I did not flinch. I did not yell. I took a slow sip of my water. "A cafeteria," I repeated, letting the word roll off my tongue. "It is honest work, Chloe," he replied, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "You have to start somewhere." "I will keep that in mind, Tristan," I said, my voice smooth as glass. "Especially when your current ventures undergo an unexpected restructuring." He frowned, the insult missing its mark, but before he could formulate a response, the ballroom lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the main stage. The crowd erupted into applause as Vanessa floated up the stairs to the microphone. She wore a stunning white gown that mirrored the cover of the book. She beamed, waving gracefully, playing the humble Southern belle to absolute perfection. "Thank you," she breathed into the microphone, pressing a hand to her heart. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This book is more than just a collection of recipes. It is the soul of the Dubois family. It is a tribute to my grandmother who taught me the magic of the kitchen." I stood near the back, my jaw locked. She had never spent a single holiday in the kitchen. She used to complain that the smell of garlic made her nauseous. But tonight is also a night of reflection. Vanessa continued, her voice trembling slightly. She looked down, playing the crowd like a maestro. As many of you know, writing this book required pulling together generations of handwritten journals. Those journals were priceless artifacts, and recently we suffered a devastating family tragedy. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the ballroom. My younger sister Chloe experienced a terrible accidental fire at her home, Vanessa said, finally looking out into the crowd and finding my face. The spotlight shifted slightly, catching the crimson of my suit. The journals were stored there. They were completely destroyed, lost forever to the flames. She reached up and wiped a single perfectly timed tear from her cheek. It broke my heart, Vanessa whispered into the microphone. It nearly broke our family. But it also made me realize how important it was to publish this book, to preserve those memories from my heart to your home. Chloe, if you are out there, I want you to know I dedicate this launch to you. We will rebuild our history together. The applause was deafening. Desmond and Valerie were clapping the loudest, beaming with pride at their golden child's magnanimous display of forgiveness and grace. Tristan was looking at me with a smug, victorious grin. They had painted me into a corner. I was the tragic, careless sister who had burned down the family legacy. Vanessa was the savior who had rescued it from the ashes. It was a flawless narrative. It was the perfect crime. I set my water glass down on a passing tray. I did not clap. I simply reached into the pocket of my crimson jacket and closed my hand around a sleek black remote control Elias had given me. The applause in the ballroom was deafening, a roaring wave of validation for a woman who had never chopped an onion in her life. Vanessa stood at the edge of the stage, the spotlight tracking her every move as she gracefully descended the carpeted stairs. She glided across the polished marble floor, parting the sea of wealthy socialites and hungry journalists. The cameras followed her like moths to a flame. She was walking directly toward me. I released my grip on the small device in my pocket and let my hands fall loosely to my sides. I stood my ground in the crimson suit, feeling the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive floral arrangements and designer perfume close in around me. Valerie and Desmond subtly positioned themselves behind Vanessa, presenting a united front of generational wealth and manufactured grace. Tristan hovered just over my right shoulder, shifting his weight onto his toes, ready to play the protective brother-in-law if the unstable, jealous sister decided to cause a scene. They all wanted me to scream. They wanted me to throw my glass to curse, to unravel exactly the way they had conditioned me to do whenever I was backed into a corner. That was their game plan. If I looked crazy, Vanessa looked like a saint. Vanessa gestured to her publicist, who quickly stepped forward and handed her a flat, neatly wrapped box. Vanessa turned back to me, her eyes wide and glistening with weaponized empathy. "Chloe, darling." Vanessa projected her voice, ensuring the nearby microphones caught every single syllable. "I know how hard this week has been for you, losing your little apartment, your kitchen, everything. But family takes care of family." She opened the box and pulled out the gift. It was not a professional chef's apron. It was a flimsy, heavily starched piece of commercial merchandise. The Dubois Southern Elegance logo was plastered across the chest in massive, gaudy letters. It felt like cheap polyester. Vanessa stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me in a crushing, highly choreographed embrace. The press erupted in a blinding storm of white light. She pressed her cheek against mine, hiding her mouth from the cameras, and let her lips brush my ear. "Even though you lost your little pots and pans, I will always let you bake in my shadow, sis," she whispered. Her voice was pure, concentrated venom, completely stripped of the warm southern charm she had just sold to the crowd. It was the voice of a woman who believed she had won the ultimate victory. I did not pull away. I did not flinch. I let the silence hang for a fraction of a second, letting her bask in the absolute certainty of her triumph. Then I stepped back. I reached out and took the stiff, cheap fabric from her hands. I looked down at the apron, tracing the logo with my thumb, and then I looked directly into my sister's eyes. I smiled. It was not a tight, forced grimace. It was a brilliant, entirely relaxed, completely predatory smile. Thank you, Vanessa, I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady over the murmur of the eager crowd. This is exactly what I deserve. I am so incredibly proud of you. You have finally shown everyone exactly who you are. The press ate it up, snapping dozens of photos of the touching sisterly reconciliation. But up close, within the tight circle of our family, the dynamic instantly fractured. Vanessa's manufactured smile faltered. She stared at me, her eyes scanning my face, desperately searching for the familiar pain, the predictable defeat, the tears she intended to provoke. She found nothing but ice. Valerie shifted uncomfortably, her knuckles turning white as she clutched her Chanel purse. Desmond frowned, looking back and forth between me and the photographers. Tristan's smug grin dissolved into a confused, defensive scowl. I was not playing my assigned role. I was not the victim, and they had absolutely no idea how to process my calm. I held up the apron for one final photograph, letting the flashbulbs capture the vibrant crimson of my tailored suit against the cheap prop in my hands. Then I smoothly folded the fabric over my arm. Enjoy your night, I told them, my gaze sweeping methodically over my mother, my father, my brother-in-law, and my sister. It is going to be a night you will never forget. I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand double doors of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me instinctively. I did not look back at the stage, at the massive banners of Vanessa's face, or at the family I was leaving behind. As I stepped out of the suffocating heat of the party and into the cool, quiet hallway of the country club, I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket. My phone was vibrating with a relentless, urgent rhythm. I pulled it out, the screen illuminating the dim mahogany-paneled corridor. It was a secure, encrypted text message from Investigator Hayes. Warrant signed by the federal judge. Arson, insurance fraud, and wire fraud. Moving in at dawn. Get clear. I exhaled a long, slow breath. The brass handles of the country club doors were cold against my palms as I pushed them open and stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. The valet rushed forward to retrieve my car, but I waved him off for a moment. I stood under the grand portico, listening to the faint muffled sound of the jazz band playing inside the ballroom. Vanessa was likely sitting at a velvet-draped table right now, signing books and securing her advance, completely unaware that the ground beneath her empire had already crumbled to dust. I unlocked my phone and opened the secure application Elias's tech team had built for me. The massive digital file was already queued up on the screen. It contained the entire mirrored server of the Dubois Family Trust, Tristan's hidden cryptocurrency ledgers, the fraudulent commercial insurance policy, and Vanessa's damning email threads with her publisher. The destination address belonged directly to the lead federal investigator of the insurance fraud division. I looked at the screen. The quiet victim who had spent 30 years begging for scraps at the Dubois table was completely gone. I pressed send. I sat in the glass-walled living room of Elias's safe house the following morning, an untouched mug of black coffee cooling beside my laptop. Elias's tech team had not just provided me with a secure connection. They had completely mirrored Tristan's digital footprint. I did not simply send the encrypted files to the insurance fraud division and wait for a phone call. I had a front-row seat to the exact moment my brother-in-law's life shattered. The digital feed on my screen showed Tristan's laptop activity in real time. It was 7 in the morning at the Dubois estate. I could perfectly picture the scene unfolding in my parents' opulent breakfast nook. The massive mahogany dining table, the imported crystal juice glasses, the smell of Valerie's expensive perfume mingling with freshly pressed linen. Tristan was likely nursing a slight hangover from his triumphant performance at the country club, basking in the glow of Vanessa's stolen success, waiting for his ultimate payday. He was arrogant, but beneath the tailored suits he was suffocating. The offshore cryptocurrency lenders were breathing down his neck, demanding the millions he had squandered from the family trust. He needed that $3 million insurance payout to survive the week. I watched the cursor on my mirrored screen move frantically as Tristan logged into his private banking portal, then navigated directly to the commercial insurance claims dashboard. He was checking for the wire transfer. He expected to see a pending deposit, a clean slate, a fresh start built on the ashes of my kitchen. Instead, the screen refreshed and a massive red banner dropped across the dashboard. The text was stark, uncompromising, and absolutely lethal. Frozen. pending arson and fraud investigation. I watched the cursor stop dead. Tristan stopped moving the mouse. The digital silence stretched for 10 agonizing seconds. I could almost hear his heart hammering against his ribs. He clicked the details tab, his panic translating into rapid, erratic movements on the trackpad. The insurance portal did not hold back. The automated message cited an anonymous encrypted submission of irrefutable evidence received by their fraud department at midnight. It explicitly listed the items currently under active review by federal authorities. High-definition security footage of his exact Range Rover fleeing the alleyway 3 minutes after the ignition point. A detailed financial workup showing his massive crypto debts establishing an undeniable motive. And finally, the physical recovery of a custom solid gold cufflink found at the epicenter of the blaze. I knew exactly what Tristan was doing in that moment. I could practically see the blood draining from his perfectly tanned face. He would be reaching for his wrist, remembering the missing piece of jewelry he thought he had lost at a crowded bar, realizing with sickening clarity that he had dropped it while pouring accelerant over my life. The illusion of his invincibility shattered instantly. The insurance company was not cutting a check. They were preparing a federal indictment. The feed showed him abruptly closing the browser. He was running. I knew the layout of my parents' estate intimately. He was sprinting past the grand staircase, ignoring Vanessa's cheerful chatter about her overnight book sales, and bursting straight into Desmond's private soundproofed study. Desmond was Tristan's ultimate shield. My father possessed the ruthless legal connections, the high-powered friends, and the sheer capital to bury almost any problem. Through the audio intercept Elias had quietly embedded in Tristan's phone, I heard the sheer terror in my brother-in-law's voice. He did not bother with polite pleasantries. He shoved his phone onto Desmond's polished desk, his voice cracking as he gasped out the truth. He told Desmond about the frozen claim. He confessed to the arson, the insurmountable cryptocurrency debt, and the highly specific evidence the insurance company now possessed. The silence from my father was chilling. Desmond did not yell. He did not express horror that his son-in-law had deliberately set fire to a building occupied by his youngest daughter. He did not care that I could have been trapped inside, that I could have burned to death. The only thing Desmond cared about was the immediate threat to the Dubois name. Tristan was his ultimate trophy. He was the wealthy, connected white son-in-law who validated Desmond's hard-fought status at the exclusive Atlanta country clubs. Tristan was supposed to be the polished heir to the family empire, the man who proved Desmond had truly made it. I was just the embarrassing caterer who refused to play the corporate game, who sent the file. Desmond's voice was dangerously low, vibrating with a cold, calculated fury. Tristan was hyperventilating, stammering wildly about anonymous hackers, corporate rivals, and bad luck. But Desmond possessed a sharp, analytical, legal mind. He connected the dots with terrifying speed. He thought about the missing cufflink. He thought about the exact timing of the submission. And then he thought about my behavior at the launch party the night before. The crimson suit, the absolute lack of tears, the chilling, perfectly poised way I smiled when Vanessa handed me that cheap apron. It was Chloe. Desmond stated the realization cementing into absolute certainty. She knows. Tristan began to panic further, begging Desmond to fix it, terrified of federal prison, terrified of losing his country club membership. Desmond slammed his hand down on the leather desk, silencing the younger man instantly. The betrayal radiating through the audio feed was absolute. My father did not pause to consider my pain, my ruined business, or the lifetime of emotional neglect he had inflicted upon me. He instantly viewed me as a hostile threat to his legacy. He prepared to utterly destroy his own flesh and blood to protect a criminal. "Calm down, Tristan," Desmond commanded, his tone devoid of any paternal warmth toward me. "She is a bitter, jealous amateur. We will spin this. We will say she set the fire herself to collect the insurance money because her catering business was failing. We will claim she stole your cufflink to frame you out of pure spite over Vanessa's success. I will unleash every senior partner at this firm. We will bury her in litigation until she breaks." I sat back in the quiet luxury of the safe house, the audio feed crackling as Desmond began barking orders to his legal team. My own father was actively plotting to frame me for a federal crime to save the man who had burned my life to the ground. He was preparing to annihilate me to protect his country club status. He thought he possessed the power to crush me beneath his heel. He had absolutely no idea that I already owned the ground he was standing on. I knew they would not wait long. Desmond Dubois did not tolerate loose ends, and to him, I was the ultimate loose end. I left Elias's safe house mid-morning, trading the crimson silk suit for a simple cashmere sweater and tailored dark slacks. I drove to a high-end cafe in the heart of Buckhead, a place frequented by the city's political power brokers and elite. I deliberately sat at a corner booth near the front window, placing myself in plain sight. I ordered a black coffee, set my phone face down on the polished marble tabletop, and tapped the screen once to activate the voice memo application. The digital timer began to count upward in silent red digits. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. They arrived exactly 12 minutes later. Desmond and Valerie did not walk into the cafe. They invaded it. My father wore his signature navy-tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly swept back, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute fury. My mother walked half a step behind him, clutching a crocodile skin handbag like a weapon. Her face was a masterclass in frozen aristocratic rage. They ignored the hostess marching straight toward my corner. They slid into the leather booth opposite me without being invited. They did not order coffee. They did not offer a greeting. They did not ask how I was coping with the loss of my home. They did not come as parents. They came as executioners. They did not see my bandaged hands. They did not see my ruined kitchen. They did not see their daughter. They saw a liability. They saw a living, breathing threat to the polished, perfect image they had spent a lifetime constructing. Desmond leaned across the small table. He invaded my personal space, his imposing frame blocking out the sunlight from the window. His voice was a lethal, hushed whisper that barely carried over the sound of the espresso machine behind the counter. "You have made a catastrophic miscalculation." Chloe Desmond said, his eyes flat and cold. "You think you are clever. You think sending a few fabricated documents to an insurance investigator gives you leverage over this family. You are a catering cook. I am a senior partner at the most powerful law firm in Atlanta. Do you honestly understand what I can do to you?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. I did not break eye contact. "What can you do, Desmond?" He smiled, a terrifying, predatory baring of teeth. "I know every single member of the Georgia State Licensing Board. I play golf with the head of the Department of Public Health. I fund the campaigns of the local zoning commissioners. By tomorrow morning, I can have every business license you hold permanently revoked. I can have your commercial kitchens condemned by health inspectors. I can have your vendors blacklisted across the entire state. I can ensure that you never serve a single plate of food in Georgia ever again. I will erase your little business from existence, and I will not lose a single second of sleep over it." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled into my chest, heavy and suffocating. He was willing to destroy my entire livelihood, my legal business, my independence. He was willing to crush me into the dirt to protect Tristan. He was willing to annihilate me to protect a man who had committed arson. Valerie leaned forward seamlessly, taking over the psychological assault. Her eyes were sharp, devoid of any maternal warmth. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Tristan is providing a future for this family," Valerie stated, her voice as cold as ice. "He is expanding the Dubois brand. He is securing our financial legacy. You are nothing but a jealous liability. You have always been jealous of your sister, and now you are trying to ruin her launch because your own life is a failure." She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face, her acrylic nail tapping the table. "Drop the insurance claim, Chloe. Retract your statements to the investigators immediately. Say your kitchen caught fire because you carelessly left a stove burning. Do it today, or we will ruin you. We will leave you with absolutely nothing." I sat perfectly still. The phone lay face down between us, silently recording every single syllable. The red timer ticked past 10 minutes. I had it all: the extortion, the complicity, the explicit threat to weaponize political connections. They had just handed me the final nails for their own coffins. "You would destroy your own daughter?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, forcing them to explicitly confirm their choice on the recording. "You would burn my life down for him." "You are not acting like a daughter," Valerie hissed, her perfectly painted lips twisting into a sneer. "You are acting like a problem, and we fix problems. They chose the lie. They chose the arsonist. They chose the image." I looked at them, feeling a profound, absolute sense of liberation. The last heavy chain of obligation I felt toward these people shattered into dust. I did not need to feel guilty for what I was about to do to them. They had already done it to themselves. Before I could formulate my response, a sharp, piercing ringtone cut through the heavy tension at the table. Valerie jumped, startled by the sudden noise. She dug into her crocodile handbag and pulled out her phone. The caller ID flashed on the screen. It was Vanessa. Valerie let out an annoyed sigh and answered the call, bringing the phone to her ear. "Vanessa, darling, we are in the middle of handling the situation with your sister. I will call you back in 5 minutes." Valerie stopped speaking. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her pale and drawn beneath her expensive makeup. Even from across the table, I could hear the shrill, hysterical screaming emanating from the phone speaker. Vanessa was not just crying. She was hyperventilating, her voice reaching a frantic, panicked pitch that bordered on a complete mental breakdown. "Calm down," Valerie commanded, her aristocratic poise slipping entirely. "Vanessa, I cannot understand a word you are saying. Breathe. Tell me what happened." Vanessa's voice shrilled through the air, loud enough for both Desmond and me to hear the absolute terror in her words. "They want me to cook." Vanessa sobbed, her breath hitching wildly. "The publisher just called the house. They booked a live segment on Good Morning America for tomorrow. Tomorrow morning, Mom. They want me to do a live cooking demonstration of the signature Dubois roast chicken and the handmade buttermilk biscuits, live on national television." Desmond stiffened, his aggressive posture collapsing as the reality of the situation hit him. "If I do not do it, the publisher is threatening to pull the book," Vanessa wailed, the sound echoing off the cafe walls. "They said the $2 million advance is contingent on this morning show appearance. Mom, I do not know how to turn on a gas stove. I do not know how to butcher a chicken. I do not know how to make biscuits. I am going to be humiliated in front of millions of people. You have to fix this." Valerie stared at her phone in absolute horror. The grand illusion was shattering. The culinary genius of the Dubois family was being called to the stage, and she was terrified of the kitchen. I picked up my coffee cup, took a slow, deliberate sip, and smiled at my parents. Valerie lowered the phone from her ear, her hand trembling so violently that the heavy gold bracelets at her wrist clattered against each other. The blood had entirely drained from her face, leaving her expensive foundation looking like a chalky mask. Desmond stared at his wife, the ruthless, predatory glint in his eyes rapidly dissolving into utter confusion. I set my coffee cup back onto its saucer with a soft, deliberate clink. The sound seemed to snap Valerie out of her paralysis. She placed the phone face up on the marble table and pressed the speaker button. Vanessa's hysterical sobs immediately echoed through the quiet, upscale cafe. "Mom, you have to do something," Vanessa wailed, her voice thick with panic. "The producers are sending a car for me at 4 in the morning. They want a full demonstration. They want me to break down a whole chicken on live television. I do not even know how to hold a chef's knife. I do not know the difference between baking soda and baking powder. The ghostwriter handled all the technical terms in the book. If I go on that show tomorrow, I am going to chop my own finger off, and the publisher is going to sue me for breach of contract." Before Valerie could formulate a soothing response, the heavy glass doors of the cafe swung open. Vanessa practically threw herself inside. She had clearly tracked our mother's phone location. The golden child of the Dubois family looked completely unhinged. Her designer sunglasses were perched askew on her head, her mascara was visibly smeared beneath her eyes, and she was hyperventilating so hard her chest heaved. She spotted our booth and scrambled toward us, sliding into the leather seat next to Valerie. She did not even register my calm demeanor or Desmond's tight, furious jaw. They want to see the Southern charm, Vanessa gasped, gripping Valerie's arm. They want the authentic Dubois family recipes brought to life. I cannot do it. I cannot fake this on live television with 3 hosts watching my every move. They will know I am a fraud in 5 seconds. I will lose the $2 million advance. My career will be over before it even starts. The silence that fell over our table was absolute heavy with the suffocating weight of irony. Less than 3 minutes ago, Desmond had leaned across this very table and threatened to permanently revoke my business licenses. Valerie had called me a jealous liability. They had promised to erase my livelihood from the state of Georgia to protect a son-in-law who had committed arson. Now their $2 million golden child was sitting in front of them, openly admitting she was a complete manufactured fraud and entirely dependent on the exact skills they had just spent 30 years mocking. I did not say a word. I simply looked at my father, letting the reality of his utter powerlessness wash over him. All of his political connections, his zoning commissioners, his country club buddies, none of them could break down a chicken on live television. None of them could save his favorite daughter from national humiliation. Valerie swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically around the cafe before settling on me. The aristocratic rage was completely gone, replaced by a sickening manufactured sweetness. Chloe. Darling, Valerie began, her voice taking on a desperate pleading pitch. You understand television, do you not? You know how these morning shows work. It is all television magic. I tilted my head, feigning mild curiosity. Television magic? Yes, Valerie insisted, leaning forward. The hosts do not expect the celebrity guest to actually cook the entire meal from scratch in a 4-minute segment. They have prep chefs behind the scenes. People who chop the vegetables, prepare the marinades, and have the finished product ready to swap out from the oven. Vanessa caught on to her mother's strategy instantly. She looked at me, her tear-streaked face suddenly illuminated by desperate hope. Chloe, please, Vanessa begged, reaching across the table to grasp my hands. I pulled my bandaged hands back, letting her fingers grasp empty air. Vanessa did not deter. You have to help me. You know these recipes better than anyone. You can come to the studio. You can hide in the prep kitchen off camera. You can do all the chopping, all the mixing, all the heavy lifting. I will just stand under the lights, toss a few pre-measured ingredients into a bowl, and smile for the cameras. No one will ever know. I stared at her, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request. She wanted me to be her ghost. She wanted me to stand in the shadows doing the grueling, skilled labor so she could step into the spotlight and claim the $2 million prize for my life's work. It was the exact dynamic of our entire childhood, perfectly distilled into a single television segment. Desmond cleared his throat desperately, trying to regain some semblance of authority. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and pulled out his leather-bound checkbook. He unscrewed a gold fountain pen and began to write. We are not asking you to do this for free, Chloe, Desmond stated, forcing his voice into a flat, businesslike tone. We understand that your own catering business is currently experiencing some unforeseen difficulties. Consider this a freelance consultation. He ripped the check from the pad and slid it across the marble table. It stopped right next to my phone, which was still silently recording every word of their panic, their admissions of fraud, and their desperate bribery. I looked down at the check. $5,000. It was a pathetic, insulting sum. $5,000 to save a $2 million book deal. $5,000 to save the Dubois family name from total public disgrace. $5,000 to swallow my pride and remain the invisible, compliant scapegoat they so desperately needed me to be. They were sweating. Valerie's breathing was shallow. Desmond's knuckles were white as he gripped his pen. Vanessa looked like she was on the verge of a cardiac event. They were entirely at my mercy, trapped in a prison of their own making, begging the daughter they despised to save them from the fire they had started. I looked at their desperate, terrified faces. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the cold, precise execution of a flawless strategy. I reached out and picked up the check, folding it neatly in half. I will do it, I said, my voice smooth, serene, and perfectly steady. I will come to the studio tomorrow morning. I will prep your ingredients. I will stand behind the cameras. I will help you pull off this performance, Vanessa. One last time. The glaring vanity lights of the green room at the Midtown Broadcasting Studio were unforgiving. They illuminated every frantic movement, every beat of sweat, every drop of manufactured panic. The air smelled of burnt hairspray, strong coffee, and the sharp metallic tang of pure adrenaline. Production assistants scurried past with clipboards, their voices a low, constant hum of organized chaos. It was 6 in the morning, and the Dubois Empire was about to be tested on live national television. Vanessa sat in the center of the room, anchored in a plush leather makeup chair, like a queen on a besieged throne. Two makeup artists hovered around her, frantically applying layers of translucent powder to hide the stress-induced blemishes blooming along her jawline. A stylist was aggressively steaming the wrinkles out of her pastel blue cashmere cardigan, the exact shade of blue chosen by a focus group to evoke Southern hospitality and maternal warmth. "Watch the eyeliner, you are pulling the lid!" Vanessa snapped, swatting blindly at the artist's hand. "If I look tired on high-definition television, my publisher will have a stroke. Fix it." I stood 10 feet away, relegated to a stainless steel prep table pushed against the cinder block wall. I was dressed in a plain black chef's coat entirely devoid of any logos or personal branding. I was exactly what she had paid for. I was the invisible hands. I was the hired help. I was the shadow she needed to cast her light. "Chloe, are those egg whites separated yet?" Vanessa barked over her shoulder, not bothering to look at me. "The segment is 8 minutes long. I cannot waste time whisking on camera. I need the stiff peaks ready. I need the dry ingredients sifted. I need everything in those little glass prep bowls. Do not mess this up for me." "Everything is perfectly measured, Vanessa," I replied, my voice a calm, even current beneath her storm. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." She wanted perfection. I would give her perfection. She wanted a masterpiece. I would build her a masterpiece. She wanted a soufflé. I would give her a bomb. The signature heritage soufflé was the crown jewel of the Dubois cookbook. It was a notoriously temperamental dish, requiring a delicate, precise balance of fat acid and leavening agents. A soufflé is not just baking. It is structural engineering. It relies entirely on chemical truth. You cannot lie to a soufflé. You cannot fake a chemical reaction. I looked down at the pristine row of glass prep bowls lined up on my stainless steel cart. They looked beautiful. They looked camera-ready. They were a complete, unmitigated disaster waiting to be activated by heat. I picked up the bowl containing the fine powdery white leavening agent. The recipe called for baking powder, which provides a slow, steady lift to keep the delicate egg white structure intact. I had not used baking powder. I had substituted it entirely with pure concentrated baking soda. The visual difference was non-existent to the untrained eye, but the chemical difference was lethal. Without the necessary acidic counter-agent, the baking soda would rapidly produce a massive surge of carbon dioxide. The soufflé would violently inflate under the studio lights, creating a brief illusion of spectacular success before instantly and catastrophically collapsing in on itself. Furthermore, unactivated baking soda leaves a distinct, aggressively metallic soapy taste that clings to the roof of the mouth. I moved to the next bowl. The recipe called for 3 tablespoons of ultra-fine baker's sugar to stabilize the egg whites and provide the signature sweet crust. I had emptied the sugar. I had refilled the bowl with 3 tablespoons of fine sea salt. It was brilliant white. It was perfectly crystalline. It was pure concentrated ruin. I measured the salt. I measured the salt with the quiet focus of an assassin. I measured the salt, knowing exactly how it would dissolve on the tongues of the morning show hosts. Finally, I adjusted the liquid ratios. I added an extra 1/4 cup of heavy cream to the base mixture. The added moisture would guarantee that the interior of the soufflé would never properly set. Beneath the rapidly collapsing crust, the center would remain a raw, gelatinous, soupy mess. It would be a visual nightmare. It would be a culinary humiliation. Vanessa pushed herself out of the makeup chair, waving away the stylist. She marched over to my prep station, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She leaned over the bowls, her eyes darting frantically over the ingredients she did not know how to name, let alone utilize. "Is this it?" she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at the perfectly whipped egg whites. "Is this everything?" "Everything is perfectly staged," I said, stepping back and wiping my hands on a pristine white towel. "All you have to do is pour bowl A into the mixer fold in bowl B and place it in the preheated display oven. The television magic will do the rest." Vanessa exhaled a long, shaky breath. The panic in her eyes receded, replaced instantly by the familiar venomous arrogance that had defined our entire relationship. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out the folded check for $5,000. She did not hand it to me. She tossed it onto the stainless steel table, letting it flutter down next to the bowl of salt. "Take it and stay out of sight," Vanessa sneered, adjusting the collar of her cashmere sweater. "When the segment is over, pack up the cart and leave through the loading dock. Do not speak to the producers. Do not look at the hosts. I am the face of this brand, Chloe. You are just the hired help. Remember your place." I looked at the check. I looked at the bowl of salt. I looked at my sister. "I know exactly what my place is, Vanessa," I said, a serene, completely relaxed smile spreading across my face. "I am right where I am supposed to be. 5 minutes to air talent to the floor." A producer bellowed from the hallway, clapping his hands sharply. Vanessa flinched, her arrogance immediately dissolving back into raw nerves. She grabbed the handle of the prep cart and forcefully pushed it out of the green room, her knuckles white. I followed 3 paces behind her, a silent shadow trailing the main attraction. The studio was a massive cavern of blinding lights, swinging boom cameras, and a sleek, fully functional kitchen set designed to mimic a sunlit country home. The 3 morning show hosts were already seated at the kitchen island, adjusting their earpieces and flashing practiced, perfectly white smiles. A production assistant intercepted Vanessa, unclipped her microphone pack, and hastily threaded the wire up the back of her sweater. They wheeled the prep cart into position directly in front of the primary camera. I stepped back. I stepped back past the teleprompter. I stepped back past the lighting rigs. I melted entirely into the darkness off camera, becoming exactly what she had demanded: invisible. Vanessa took her position behind the gleaming marble counter. She placed her hands flat on the surface, her chest heaving as she stared at the row of glass bowls I had prepared for her. The hosts turned toward her, their expressions radiating manufactured morning warmth. The floor director stepped forward, raising his hand high in the air. The studio fell into absolute pin-drop silence. He pointed his index finger directly at my sister, his voice echoing in the vast room. 3, 2, 1. You're live. Vanessa stepped under the bright studio lights, flashing her $1,000,000 smile. The red recording lights on the massive studio cameras flared to life. The lead anchor, a famously energetic woman named Sarah, turned to face the lens with a practiced, radiant expression. "We are back on Good Morning America," Sarah announced, her voice bouncing brightly off the soundproof walls. "And today we are bringing a little Southern comfort to your morning." Joining us in the studio is the new darling of the culinary world, Vanessa Dubois, sharing the secrets behind her highly anticipated debut book, The Dubois Heritage Table. Welcome, Vanessa. "Thank you so much for having me," Vanessa purred. She leaned against the marble kitchen island, crossing her ankles to perfectly display her designer heels. The camera angle tightened, capturing the array of glass prep bowls I had arranged with lethal precision just minutes prior. "This book is a love letter to my family," Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with artificial nostalgia. "Cooking is not just a hobby for the Dubois women. It is in our blood. It is a deep culinary root that stretches back generations. I spent my entire childhood in the kitchen, learning at my grandmother's knee, discovering that the true secret to Southern cuisine is the love and authenticity you pour into every single dish." I stood completely still in the dark void behind the camera operators, my arms crossed over my chest. I listened to my sister effortlessly steal my history, my late nights, my burns, and my scars, packaging them into a neat, marketable soundbite. She did not even blink. "Today you are showing us the crown jewel of your book, the signature heritage soufflé." The male co-host chimed in, leaning over the counter to inspect the ingredients. Now soufflés notoriously intimidate home cooks. What is the Dubois secret to getting that perfect towering lift? Vanessa let out a light musical laugh. She picked up a silicone spatula, holding it awkwardly, her grip entirely wrong for someone who claimed to have spent decades in a kitchen. It is all about confidence and respecting the chemical balance of your ingredients, Vanessa stated boldly, reciting a line I had written for her marketing packet weeks ago. You have to treat the egg whites with absolute respect. She reached for the bowls I had prepared. She dumped the heavy weeping egg whites into the base mixture. Anyone who had ever baked a single cake would have immediately noticed the wrong consistency. The extra heavy cream I had added made the batter thick, greasy, and completely devoid of the necessary aeration. But Vanessa simply scraped the sides of the bowl, oblivious to the fact that she was mixing wet cement. She poured the ruined, salty, chemical-laden sludge into 4 buttered ramekins, tapping them aggressively against the marble counter and knocking out whatever microscopic air bubbles remained. You pop these into a 400-degree oven for exactly 22 minutes. Vanessa instructed the cameras, sliding the tray into the gleaming display oven behind her. But through the magic of television, I have a batch that is just finishing up right now. She turned to the second display oven. This was the moment. This was the swap out. She expected to open that door and find 4 towering, golden brown, perfectly risen soufflés that I was supposed to have baked in the off-camera prep kitchen. She expected to present my masterpiece and claim it as her own. Vanessa reached for the stainless steel handle and pulled the oven door open. The disaster was instantaneous and absolute. A thick, acrid plume of gray smoke billowed out of the oven cavity, rolling across the pristine studio kitchen set. The stench hit the air immediately. It did not smell like baked goods. It smelled like scorching metal, burning sea salt, and rancid boiling dairy. The concentrated baking soda had reacted violently to the intense heat without an acid to neutralize it. The soufflés had not just fallen, they had erupted like small toxic volcanoes before entirely collapsing into a smoking liquid mess. Vanessa froze, the oven door still clutched in her hand. She stared into the cavity, her perfect smile sliding off her face to reveal sheer, unadulterated panic. Inside the ramekins sat a bubbling gray gelatinous sludge. Grease from the excess cream had separated and was dripping down the sides of the dishes, sizzling and smoking as it hit the hot oven racks. The male co-host leaned forward to look, then immediately recoiled. He coughed loudly, turning his head away from the counter and bringing a hand to his mouth, genuinely gagging on live television. The putrid, soapy, metallic smell was overpowering. "Oh my!" Sarah gasped, breaking her professional composure as she waved a hand frantically in front of her face to clear the smoke. "That is a very unique aroma." A collective audible gasp rippled through the live studio audience. The silence that followed was deafening, save for the sickening sound of the ruined batter bubbling and popping in the hot oven. Vanessa stood paralyzed under the bright lights. The cameras pushed in tight on her face, broadcasting her total humiliation to millions of viewers. Her carefully constructed persona shattered completely. She looked wildly around the studio, her eyes wide with terror, desperately searching for Valerie, for Desmond, for anyone to save her. "There is something wrong with your equipment," Vanessa stammered, her voice shrill and trembling. "The calibration on this studio oven is completely off. Commercial ovens run entirely too hot. It destroyed my perfect batter. The heating element must be broken." I did not wait for the producers to cut to a commercial. I did not wait for the floor director to intervene. I uncrossed my arms and stepped out from the dark, quiet shadows of the prep area. I walked past the rolling cables, past the stunned production assistants, and past the heavy boom microphones. I stepped directly onto the brightly lit set, adjusting the collar of my pristine, unmarked black chef's coat, walking straight into the unforgiving glare of the national television cameras. The heavy silence of the studio was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of my sensible, slip-resistant work shoes against the polished floor. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a professional entering her own domain. The camera operators, operating on pure instinct, widened their shots to capture my sudden intrusion. Sarah, the lead anchor, was still waving smoke away from her face, her eyes wide with confusion as she looked at my stark black chef's coat. She likely assumed I was the culinary producer, stepping in to salvage a disastrous segment. She was entirely mistaken. I stopped directly beside the smoking oven, ignoring the putrid stench of the ruined soufflés. I turned my back to my sister, completely cutting her out of the primary camera angle, and addressed the bewildered hosts with a calm, resonant voice. "Good morning, Sarah," I said, my tone carrying the authority of a woman who had spent 15 years commanding commercial kitchens. "I apologize for the smoke. My name is Chef Chloe Dubois, and I am the actual creator of the signature heritage soufflé, along with every single other recipe featured in the book you are promoting today." A collective gasp swept through the studio audience, far louder and more genuine than their reaction to the culinary explosion just moments prior. The male co-host lowered his hand from his mouth, his jaw dropping open. Vanessa let out a strangled, breathless noise behind me. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with a mixture of terror and fury. "Get off the stage!" I ignored her entirely. I reached inside the deep breast pocket of my chef's coat and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I opened it with steady fingers and withdrew a stack of dense legal documents. They were not printouts. They were not photocopies. They were original, legally bound, federally stamped copyright registrations. The gold foil seals caught the harsh glare of the studio lights flashing brilliantly for the millions of viewers watching at home. I placed the documents squarely on the marble island right next to the smoking ruins of Vanessa's attempt at baking. "What you just witnessed was not a calibration error with your studio equipment," I explained, looking directly into the red lens of the center camera. "What you witnessed was an imposter attempting to execute a complex chemical formula without understanding the basic science behind it. 2 years ago, I legally copyrighted every recipe, every technique, and every personal family anecdote contained within the Dubois Heritage Table. I wrote it, I tested it, I perfected it. The woman standing behind me, my sister, is a complete and absolute fraud." The studio descended into absolute bedlam. Sarah's professional composure completely evaporated. She stared at the federal stamps on the documents, her eyes darting between me and the weeping, trembling woman standing in the background. The floor director was waving his arms wildly, yelling into his headset, desperately trying to get instructions from the control booth. "You are lying," Vanessa screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed off the high studio ceiling. She lunged forward desperately, trying to snatch the documents off the marble counter. I simply placed my hand flat over the stack, looking at her with absolute indifference. "She is insane!" Vanessa wailed, turning her tear-streaked, completely unhinged face toward the cameras. "She is just a jealous catering cook. She stole those papers. She is trying to ruin me." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth required no volume. "The publisher of this book," I continued, my voice easily, cutting through Vanessa's frantic screaming, "has been sold stolen intellectual property. Every advance paid, every promotional dollar spent, and every contract signed has been executed under fraudulent pretenses. The Dubois culinary brand is built on a foundation of theft. I am the chef. Vanessa is merely a very expensive and clearly malfunctioning prop." Off camera, in the VIP viewing area, absolute panic erupted. 3 executives wearing sharp suits with publisher lanyards around their necks were suddenly moving in a frantic, uncoordinated swarm. One man had gone completely pale, his hands trembling as he furiously dialed his cell phone, practically screaming at whoever answered. Another representative was frantically gesturing at the floor director, making violent slashing motions across his throat, begging them to cut the live feed. The $2 million advance, the massive promotional tour, the entire fabricated empire of the Dubois family legacy. I could practically see the numbers vaporizing in the air above their heads. Vanessa realized it too. She looked past the cameras, seeing the publisher's representatives backing away in horror, seeing the disgusted faces of the studio audience, seeing the total irreversible collapse of her entire manufactured life. She let out a guttural, primitive scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. She grabbed the smoking ramekin of ruined soufflé with her bare hands, shrieking as the hot ceramic burned her skin, and hurled it across the kitchen set. It shattered against the faux brick wall, sending a spray of gray, salty sludge across the pristine set pieces. She fell to her knees right there on the studio floor, sobbing uncontrollably, her designer clothes stained with grease and soot. The polished, perfect persona of the Dubois golden child was gone, replaced by a desperate, crying fraud exposed before the entire world. Cut it! Go to commercial! Go to commercial right now! The floor director roared, his voice finally breaking through the chaos. The red light on the center camera blinked out. The bright studio lights dimmed slightly. The live feed was severed, but the damage was permanent, recorded and broadcast to millions. I stood calmly at the counter, gathered my federal copyright documents, and slid them back into my manila envelope. The destruction was absolute, and my hands were entirely clean. The heavy silence of the studio was broken only by the rhythmic squeak of my sensible slip-resistant work shoes against the polished floor. I did not rush. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a professional entering her own domain. The camera operators, acting on pure instinct and the magnetic pull of unscripted drama, smoothly pivoted their heavy lenses to follow my intrusion. Sarah, the lead anchor, was still coughing softly, her eyes watering from the noxious fumes pouring out of the display oven. She looked at my stark black chef's coat, her professional smile completely gone. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice wavering with confusion. "Are you part of the studio culinary team? We seem to have a major malfunction here." Vanessa spun around. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, the last trace of color drained from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost, and in a way she had. I was the ghost who had written her book. "Security!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking into a panicked, shrill octave that made the sound engineer in the booth wince. "Get her out of here! She does not belong on this set. She is crazy! Cut the cameras!" I did not even look at her. I stepped directly beside the smoking oven, taking my place at the center of the marble island. I turned my back to my sister, effectively cutting her out of the primary camera angle, and looked directly down the barrel of the main broadcasting lens. "Good morning, America," I said, my voice calm, resonant, and entirely in control. "I apologize for the smoke, the smell, and the interruption. What you have just witnessed was not a malfunction of the studio equipment. You have just witnessed the inevitable result of an imposter attempting to execute a complex chemical formula without understanding the basic science behind it." A collective, audible gasp swept through the live studio audience. It was far louder and more genuine than their reaction to the culinary explosion just moments prior. The male co-host lowered his hand from his mouth, his jaw dropping open as he stared at me. "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, completely abandoning her teleprompter. "Who are you?" "My name is Chef Chloe Dubois," I stated clearly, letting my true title ring out over the national broadcast. "I am the actual creator of the signature heritage soufflé. Furthermore, I am the sole author and culinary mind behind every single recipe, technique, and family anecdote contained within the book you are promoting today." Vanessa let out a strangled, breathless noise behind me. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm with her manicured claws. "Shut up!" she hissed, her teeth bared like a cornered animal. "You are ruining my life." I smoothly stepped out of her grasp, turning to face her with absolute icy indifference. "You ruined your own life, Vanessa. I just provided the ingredients." I reached inside the deep breast pocket of my chef's coat and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. I opened it with steady fingers and withdrew a stack of dense legal documents. They were not flimsy printouts. They were original, legally bound, federally stamped copyright registrations. The gold foil seals caught the harsh glare of the studio lights, flashing brilliantly. I placed the documents squarely on the marble island right next to the smoking ruins of Vanessa's attempt at baking. I spread them out so the overhead camera could capture the unmistakable federal seals and my name printed clearly on every single page. "My sister cannot bake a soufflé because she did not write this recipe," I explained to the millions of viewers watching at home. 2 years ago, I legally copyrighted my entire life's work. I secured the intellectual property rights to my culinary heritage long before my family decided to steal my manuscript and sell it to a major publishing house for a $2 million advance. The studio descended into absolute bedlam. Sarah stared at the federal stamps on the documents, her eyes darting between me and the weeping, trembling woman standing in the background. The floor director was waving his arms wildly, yelling frantically into his headset, desperately trying to get instructions from the control booth on how to handle a live corporate disaster. I prepped the ingredients for this segment 10 minutes ago. I continued speaking over the rising chaos in the room. I swapped the ultra-fine baker's sugar for pure sea salt. I replaced the baking powder with concentrated baking soda. I added excess heavy cream to destroy the aeration. A real chef would have noticed the heavy, greasy texture of the batter. A real chef would have smelled the chemical difference instantly. My sister noticed nothing. She poured wet cement into a ramekin and expected a miracle because she is a complete and absolute fraud. Off camera, in the VIP viewing area, the publishing executives were imploding. I looked past the cameras and saw a woman in a sharp gray suit drop her clipboard, her hands flying to her mouth in sheer horror. Beside her, the lead legal counsel for the publishing house had gone the color of ash. He was frantically dialing his cell phone, practically screaming into the receiver. They had just realized they had purchased stolen goods. The massive promotional tour, the nationwide printing, the $2 million advance, all of it was suddenly rendered void, illegal, and highly actionable. Vanessa realized it too. She looked past the cameras, seeing the publisher's representatives backing away in horror. She saw the disgusted faces of the studio audience. She saw the total, irreversible collapse of her entire manufactured empire. She completely snapped. The polished, perfect persona of the Dubois golden child vaporized in an instant. She let out a guttural, primitive scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation and rage. She grabbed the smoking ramekin of ruined soufflé with her bare hands, shrieking as the hot ceramic burned her palms, and hurled it blindly across the kitchen set. It shattered violently against the faux brick wall, sending a spray of gray, salty sludge across the pristine set pieces and the expensive cameras. "I will kill you!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. She threw herself across the marble counter, attempting to sweep my copyright documents onto the floor. I placed my hand firmly over the stack, watching her unravel with complete detachment. Her designer clothes were stained with grease and soot. Her expensive makeup was running down her face in dark, muddy streaks. "Cut the feed! Go to commercial! Cut to commercial right now!" The floor director roared, his voice finally breaking through the pandemonium. The red light on the center camera blinked out. The bright studio lights dimmed rapidly as the network scrambled to throw up a commercial break. The live feed was severed, but the damage was already done, recorded, and forever branded into the public consciousness. Vanessa collapsed onto the studio floor, sobbing hysterically into her soot-stained hands. Her deal was gone. Her reputation was incinerated. Her career was over before it had even truly begun. I stood calmly in the center of the wreckage, my pristine black coat completely untouched by the mess around me. Desmond's hand was suspended in the air, a physical manifestation of his blind rage. His face was contorted into a mask of aristocratic fury, his eyes wide and wild as he prepared to strike the daughter who had just humiliated his golden child on national television. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stared directly into his eyes, waiting for the blow to fall, knowing it would be the very last mistake he ever made. Before his hand could complete its downward arc, the heavy mahogany front doors of the Dubois mansion shattered inward with a deafening crash. The sound echoed through the vaulted foyer, bouncing off the crystal chandelier and freezing everyone in place. Investigator Hayes stormed into the grand entryway, flanked by 3 heavily armed police officers. Their heavy tactical boots trampled over the imported silk rugs without hesitation. Valerie let out a piercing shriek, dropping her crystal wine glass. It shattered against the Italian marble floor, sending shards of glass and red wine splashing across the pristine baseboards. Desmond spun around, his rage instantly transferring to the intruders. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed, puffing out his chest in a desperate display of authority. "Do you know who I am? I will have your badges for breaking into my home." Hayes did not even look at him. He bypassed my father entirely, his eyes locked on the sniveling figure cowering near the grand staircase. Tristan had frozen mid-step, his packed designer suitcase dropping from his hand and tumbling down 3 carpeted stairs. Tristan Dubois Hayes announced, his voice carrying the absolute unyielding authority of the law. "You are under arrest." 2 officers moved with practiced efficiency. They grabbed Tristan by the arms, spinning him around and slamming him roughly against the polished oak banister. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly in the sudden suffocating silence of the house. Tristan instantly dissolved into a sobbing, trembling mess. His knees buckled and the officers had to haul him upright by his armpits. "Dad, do something!" Tristan wailed, tears streaming freely down his perfectly manicured face. "Dad, tell them to stop. They cannot do this to me. I am a Dubois." Desmond stepped forward, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "Release my son immediately," he demanded, pointing a trembling finger at Hayes. "You have absolutely no grounds to enter my property and assault my boy. This is a massive mistake." Hayes pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and held it up. "I have a warrant signed by a Superior Court Judge, Desmond. Your son is being charged with first-degree arson, insurance fraud, and reckless endangerment. We have the financial records, the bank transfers, and the recorded testimony of the men he hired to burn down his own development project." Valerie collapsed onto the velvet settee, burying her face in her hands and sobbing hysterically. "My beautiful boy," she wailed. "He is innocent." Chloe set him up. "She is doing this to destroy us because she has always been jealous." Tristan continued to thrash uselessly against the grip of the officers, crying like a spoiled toddler who had finally been told no. "Please, Dad, call our lawyers. Call the mayor. You know everyone in this city. Fix this right now." I watched the pathetic display with absolute calm. I slowly unbuttoned the collar of my chef's coat, savoring the cool air in the room. I walked over to the massive glass coffee table in the center of the living area. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick black legal binder. I tossed it onto the table. It hit the glass surface with a heavy final thud that silenced Valerie's weeping. "Your lawyers cannot fix this, Desmond," I stated clearly, drawing every eye in the room back to me. "Tristan is not just facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary, he is entirely bankrupt." Desmond tore his gaze away from his crying son and glared at me. "You are lying," he spat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his escalating panic. "Tristan runs the most successful commercial real estate firm in the city. He is a visionary." I opened the binder and spread the documents across the table. "I invite you to look at his vision, Father. Tristan's firm has been insolvent for over 14 months. He leveraged every single property he owned to cover his massive systemic failures. When the banks refused to lend him another dime, he resorted to burning down his own buildings to collect the insurance payouts. But even those fraudulent payouts were not enough to cover the massive crater of his toxic debt." Tristan sobbed louder, hanging his head in shame as his carefully constructed lies were laid bare in front of the parents who had worshipped him. "A private hedge fund stepped in 6 months ago." I continued tracing my finger over the bold print on the top document. "Vanguard Holdings. They bought up every single piece of Tristan's toxic debt for pennies on the dollar. They own his commercial properties. They own his firm. They own his cars. They own the very clothes he packed in that suitcase." Desmond sneered desperately, trying to cling to his fading superiority. "Then we will simply buy the debt back. We have the resources. We will squash Vanguard Holdings and whoever runs it. We will not let some faceless corporation take down our family." I smiled. It was a cold, sharp expression that made my father take an involuntary step back. "You cannot squash Vanguard Holdings, Desmond. Because I am Vanguard Holdings. I am the sole proprietor. I created the fund using the capital from my own highly successful catering and consulting businesses. Businesses you completely ignored and belittled while you were busy funding Tristan's delusions of grandeur." The color drained entirely from Desmond's face. He stared at the documents, recognizing my legal name printed clearly on the ownership certificates. Valerie stopped crying, her mouth dropping open in sheer disbelief. Your golden boy owes me exactly $10 million, I announced, letting the magnitude of the number settle over the room. The debt is due immediately upon his arrest per the clauses he eagerly signed, without bothering to read the fine print. Tristan let out a pathetic wail as the police began dragging him toward the front doors. I am sorry, he cried out, his voice cracking. I am so sorry, Chloe. Please do not do this to me. Take him away, Hayes instructed the officers. They pulled Tristan out into the cold night air, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminating the manicured lawn. Desmond stood frozen, staring at the financial records. He swallowed hard, trying to regain his composure, trying to find a way to separate himself from the wreckage. This is Tristan's failure, Desmond said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It is his debt. You can take his firm. You can ruin his life if you are truly that vindictive. But it has nothing to do with me or your mother. We are the Dubois family. We are insulated from his stupidity. I let out a short, genuine laugh. I flipped to the final section of the binder and slid a specific contract directly in front of him. I tapped the bottom of the page right next to two very familiar signatures. You are not insulated, Desmond. You are tethered to him. When Tristan needed his final desperate injection of cash to keep up the appearance of success, he required guarantors. He needed someone with substantial assets to co-sign the loans. Valerie stood up from the settee, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the armrest to stay upright. What are you saying? She whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I am saying you co-signed his loans, Mother. You and Desmond put your signatures on these documents because you could not bear the thought of the country club finding out your son was a failure. You could not stomach the embarrassment of Tristan downsizing his lavish lifestyle. You tied the entire Dubois family trust, including this very mansion, to his debt as collateral. Desmond picked up the paper with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, landing on his own bold signature. His chest began to heave as the reality of the situation crushed the air out of his lungs. He looked at me, realizing he was no longer looking at the scapegoat daughter, but the architect of his total destruction. You are legally responsible for the $10 million, I stated with absolute finality. And since Tristan has defaulted by committing felony fraud, I am calling in the debt. I own the family trust. I own your bank accounts. I own this mansion. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property before I have you forcibly evicted. You are entirely, completely ruined. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind the officers, severing the sound of Tristan begging for salvation. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers strobed through the tall transom windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the Italian marble floor. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. In the corner of the foyer, Vanessa finally broke. She had fled the television studio and rushed back to the only sanctuary she knew, only to watch it be repossessed. Her designer dress was still stained with the chemical sludge of her failed baking segment. Her publisher had already emailed her a termination notice and a massive lawsuit for fraud. She slid down the silk wallpaper, pulling her knees to her chest, and began to wail. She was stripped of her golden child status, stripped of her stolen cookbook, and stripped of her future. Desmond and Valerie stood paralyzed in the center of the wreckage. The arrogant patriarch and the status-obsessed matriarch looked at the financial documents spread across the glass table. The $10 million debt was real. The loss of their country club standing was real. The end of the Dubois empire was a mathematical fact. Valerie moved first. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the floor, ignoring the shards of broken crystal and spilled wine that soaked into her expensive skirt. She crawled toward me, reaching out with trembling hands to grasp the hem of my chef coat. Chloe, please. Valerie sobbed, her carefully styled hair falling into her tear-streaked face. You cannot do this. We are your parents. We are your family. You cannot put us on the street. We will have nothing. Where will we go? Desmond dropped to his knees beside her. The proud, unyielding man who had spent my entire life telling me I was a disappointment was suddenly weeping like a terrified child. Chloe, listen to your mother. Desmond pleaded, clasping his hands together. We share the same blood. You cannot destroy your own flesh and blood over money. We made mistakes, yes, but we are family. I looked down at the two people kneeling at my feet. I did not feel a shred of pity. I did not feel a sudden surge of familial loyalty. I felt nothing but the icy calm of a woman who had finally balanced the scales. Family, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. That is a fascinating word for you to use tonight, Desmond. Where was that family blood when I was working 16-hour shifts in a sweltering commercial kitchen just to pay my rent? Where was that family loyalty when you hosted your lavish charity galas in this very house and forced me to use the servant entrance so your wealthy friends would not know your daughter was a caterer? You only claim me as blood when you are bleeding out. I stepped back, forcing Valerie to let go of my coat. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a slim red leather folio. I dropped it onto the glass table, right on top of the foreclosure documents. However, I said, my voice cutting through their sobbing like a blade. I am not like you. I do not find joy in watching people starve. I am offering you an alternative to homelessness. I call it ruthless mercy. Desmond scrambled up, leaning over the table to look at the red folio with desperate, hungry eyes. What is it? He asked, his voice shaking. What do we have to do? Inside that folio is a contract, I explained, crossing my arms. If you sign it, I will absorb Tristan's $10 million debt. I will stop the foreclosure process. I will pay off Vanguard Holdings, and I will ensure that neither of you spend your retirement sleeping in a homeless shelter. Valerie let out a loud gasp of relief. Oh, thank God, she wept, reaching for her husband. I knew you had a good heart, Chloe. I knew you would not abandon us. There are conditions, I stated sharply, halting her celebration instantly. First, you will sign the deed of this mansion over to me tonight. You will relinquish all ownership, all equity, and all rights to this property. The Dubois estate will legally belong to me. Desmond flinched, his face turning pale. But Chloe, this house is our legacy. Your legacy is currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser facing federal arson charges, I reminded him coldly. You no longer have a legacy. You have a choice. Sign the deed or pack your bags tonight. They stared at the contract, the reality of their total defeat washing over them. But I was not finished. The second condition is non-negotiable, I continued. Beneath the property transfer, you will find two sworn legally binding affidavits. They detail exactly how much you knew about Tristan's fraudulent activities. They outline how you helped him hide assets, how you co-signed toxic loans, knowing his business was failing, and how you actively aided in covering up his arson to protect your social standing. You will sign those confessions right now. Valerie gasped in horror, clutching her chest. You want us to confess to a crime, Chloe? If we sign those, you could send us to prison. Exactly, I said, maintaining direct eye contact with my mother. Those affidavits are my insurance policy. If you ever try to sue me, if you ever try to contest my ownership of this house, or if you ever try to retaliate against me in any way, I will hand those signed confessions directly to Investigator Hayes. You will trade this mansion for a federal penitentiary. The silence in the foyer was absolute. Even Vanessa had stopped crying, staring at me in terrified awe. Desmond and Valerie looked at each other. They looked at the flashing police lights still illuminating the front windows. They looked at the cold, hard reality of their situation. They had no money. They had no leverage. They had no allies left in the world. Desmond picked up the gold-plated pen resting on the glass table. His hand was shaking violently. He flipped open the red folio. He signed his name on the property transfer, surrendering the mansion he prized above his own children. Then he turned to the sworn affidavit. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before dragging the pen across the signature line, legally binding himself to his own crimes. He handed the pen to Valerie. She sobbed openly as she scrawled her name next to his, trading her freedom for a roof over her head. I picked up the red folio, inspecting the signatures to ensure they were complete. I closed the leather cover and tucked it securely under my arm. The transfer of power was absolute. The empire they had built on lies and favoritism was now entirely mine. I looked down at the former owners of the Dubois estate. They were still kneeling on the floor, broken, exhausted, and utterly defeated. "You may sleep in the guest bedrooms on the east wing," I instructed them, turning toward the front door. "The master suite is mine now. You are officially tenants in my house. You will be expected to maintain the property, and rent is due on the first of every single month. Do not be late." Exactly 1 year had passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the Dubois estate had shattered inward, taking the remnants of my family's fabricated legacy with them. The passage of time is often described as a healing force, but in my experience, time acts more like a clarifying lens. It strips away the noise and leaves only the undeniable truth of who we really are. The air inside the Vanguard Room, Atlanta's most exclusive private dining establishment, was perfumed with the rich, earthy aroma of toasted brown butter, fresh white truffles, and seared Wagyu beef. The atmosphere was a symphony of hushed, wealthy voices and the delicate, rhythmic clinking of fine crystal. I walked through the swinging doors of the kitchen, moving with the measured, deliberate pace of a woman completely in her element. I wore a custom, immaculate white chef's coat tailored perfectly to my frame, with my name embroidered in subtle silver thread above the breast pocket. There were no stains, no burn marks, and no shadows of the past clinging to the pristine fabric. I surveyed the dining room, orchestrating the flawless synchronized service with slight nods and precise hand gestures to my waiting staff. Every table was filled with elite clients, investors, and culinary critics who had booked their reservations 6 months in advance. They were not here for a famous name. They were here for the undeniable quality of my work. I made my way to the VIP chef's table, a prime viewing spot situated right at the edge of the open kitchen. Elias was seated there, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, looking completely at ease in the empire we had built together. He was tapping the screen of a sleek digital tablet, reviewing the final quarterly reports. He looked up as I approached, his eyes reflecting a mixture of deep respect and shared triumph. "We are officially clear across the board," Elias said, his voice a low, steady rumble of satisfaction. "The legal team just sent over the final closure documents regarding the total liquidation of the Dubois family trust. The last of Tristan's toxic assets have been seized, dismantled, and repurposed into capital for your upcoming expansion into Charleston." He slid the tablet across the polished mahogany table so I could view the digital archive. "I need your final approval on the legal ledgers," he continued, pointing to the screen. "Once you sign off on those files, the absolute erasure of your family's financial standing is permanently sealed in the Federal Registry." I glanced at the screen, my eyes scanning the meticulous records of their downfall. Everything was perfectly in order. My parents were still living in the east wing of the Buckhead mansion, quietly and obediently, paying me rent on the first of every month, completely terrified of the sworn affidavits resting securely in my private vault. "It is approved," I told Elias, tapping the confirmation button on the screen. "Close the accounts." As the screen flashed green, my gaze drifted past Elias to the muted flat-screen television mounted discreetly above the sleek onyx bar across the room. The local news was playing on a silent loop. A photograph flashed on the screen, freezing me in place for a fraction of a second. It was Tristan. He was no longer wearing his bespoke Italian suits or flashing his arrogant $1,000,000 smile. He looked gaunt, hollowed out, and utterly defeated, dressed in a shapeless beige federal jumpsuit. The news ticker scrolling across the bottom of the screen told the final chapter of his story. Former real estate mogul Tristan Dubois, sentenced to 10 years in federal penitentiary without possibility of parole for arson and fraud. 10 years in a federal cage. 10 years of answering to guards instead of sycophants. He had burned down his own buildings for a payout, and in the process he had incinerated his own life. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of a man who believed the rules of reality did not apply to him. Hundreds of miles away, in a grim fluorescent-lit building that smelled permanently of stale grease and despair, the golden child of the Dubois family was facing her own personal purgatory. Vanessa stood in front of a splattering deep fryer, wearing a cheap, poorly fitting polyester uniform that clung uncomfortably to her sweating skin. A ridiculous grease-stained paper hat sat atop hair that was no longer professionally highlighted or styled. The massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit filed by her former publisher for breach of contract and intellectual property theft had left her completely destitute. Her wages were garnished to the absolute legal limit. Every dollar she made above minimum wage was immediately seized to pay off the monumental debt of her televised fraud. She turned toward the drive-through window, her face drawn and lined with profound exhaustion. She handed a greasy brown paper bag to a teenager sitting in a beat-up sedan. The teenager snatched the bag, immediately snapping at her for forgetting to include extra ketchup packets. Vanessa, who had once demanded private dressing rooms and custom-imported ingredients, swallowed her pride, mumbled a quiet, humiliating apology, and turned back to the fry vat. Her entire existence was now measured in minimum wage hours and the smell of cheap burning oil. Back in the Vanguard room, Elias reached across the table and handed me a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. He stood up, raising his own glass to meet mine. "To the Empire," Elias said, his voice filled with quiet reverence. "And to the woman who built it from the ground up." I looked at the golden liquid catching the light in my glass. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated hell my family had put me through. I thought about the dark kitchens, the stolen recipes, the arrogance, and the endless attempts to break my spirit and bury my talent. They had tried to set my entire life on fire. They had intended for me to burn to ashes so they could warm their hands by the flames of my destruction. They simply did not understand the nature of the fire they were playing with. A fire can certainly destroy everything in its path, reducing weak, brittle things to dust and smoke. But if the core material is strong enough, the fire does not destroy. It purifies. It burns away the useless exterior and applies the agonizing necessary pressure required for transformation. The fire they set to destroy me had only served to forge me into something infinitely harder, sharper, and entirely unbreakable. "To the Empire," I replied, my voice steady and completely at peace. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute victory, and clinked my crystal glass against his. The bright, sharp ring of the toast echoed over the low hum of the dining room. I took a slow sip of the champagne, savoring the taste of my own hard-won success, turned on my heel, and walked back into the commanding heat of my pristine kitchen. True power never comes from the approval of a toxic family. It is fiercely forged in the fires of their rejection. When the people who should protect you choose to tear you down, your absolute greatest weapon becomes your own unyielding independence. You do not need to inherit a corrupt legacy when you can build a flawless empire of your own. The absolute hardest lesson is realizing that the cruel labels placed upon you by jealous relatives are merely bitter reflections of their own deep insecurities, never your actual worth. Walking away to build your own table is true victory. If this story of taking back control resonated with you, hit subscribe and share your own triumph over toxic family dynamics in the comments.